for the NHS. You've had a great idea, you've made it happen, and it's made a big difference to how we can learn from COVID-19 and enter a new normal. Ideas like yours drive improvement and they deserve to be shared. That's what BOB does. Amplifying good ideas like yours across the NHS so as many people as possible can learn from, adapt and implement your idea. The further good ideas are shared by the BOB community who learn from them, the greater improvement we can achieve. You made a change. Share your solution with others. Speak to BOB.
That when starting NHS project, big or small, staff actually find it very hard to discover the experience and practice of others who have delivered something similar. So that's what we're trying to do is unpack those elusive how-tos so other people can learn. Now, the concept was actually developed, which is
Neil, sorry.
So on the next slide, hopefully you'll see a picture of the team who actually developed the concept of BOB. So on the slide you have Frida, Stephen, Arthur, Laura, Chris and Mark there underneath. And this is the team that developed the core concept. And I particularly just want to say a massive thank you to Frida, Katunda and to Laura Bailey, who were really, really unbelievably supportive of the project.
So the first one I'd like to highlight is a session we've got tomorrow at 11 o'clock, which is about building confidence in sharing. And we've got some great panelists joining us there. Some of those people have written stories on our site and will be sharing their experiences of how they've done that, why they did that, and what it means to them. And then in the session after that, at 12 o'clock tomorrow, we have a session about the theory behind spreading and scaling. And this is, again, looking at the human factors. What's the psychology behind it? Why does that matter? And we're hearing from some very interesting folk, psychologists, some sociologists and behavioural experts there. So Siri, Christina, Catherine, Lisa. And we're going to be sharing their pearls of wisdom on that session. So tune in for that. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And just to go back to BOB and what we've done. So as Neil mentions, the story to date, and when I came on board, then it was about, right, let's build this now. And so straight away we got cracking with building an amazing team. And we've all swung into action to really get BOB built. BOB is live, has been live since April. And we're continually iterating the product, talking to people across the NHS, building collaborations. But the key thing that unites this bunch of happy looking folk on this slide is that we all share the same values. If you can go to the next slide, please. And these values are four of them. So being kind, collaborative, resilient, and trustworthy. And for us, it was really critical to develop a set of values from the very beginning to unite the team so that we all come together under this same banner. And this isn't meant to be some kind of cheesy corporate exercise, although initially, I've got to admit to you, it did feel a bit like that. It's not that, and I've seen the way this comes out in the reality, and I think what this means is that we're all in it together. We all understand where each other is at. And also, more importantly, when we come to working with other partners and collaborators, we are very clear about what we are as a company, who we are as people, and we look for the same kind of traits in others. And luckily, you know, the NHS actually does share a lot of these values that are similar to ours, and so it starts us on a good footing in terms of where we go with that kind of relationship going forward. So these are very important to us. And as I've said, we can go to the next slide, please. It's very important as we look to build collaborations across the health system. And just like to flag one of our key collaborators who we've been working with for actually a couple of years now, I should say, Dr. Jill Bailey and Professor Charles Vincent from BOB.health NHS Foundation Trust. And we met with Jill a few years back now, and really, again, looking at shared values, shared beliefs. It was really important. From the very first meeting, we realised that we just connected. We just had the same beliefs about not only as people and morals, but also what we believed needed to happen to help spread information across the system, and ultimately what a benefit that could be for everyone. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What this means is, as well, for us, is that everything we do, everything we create, has been done with NHS staff, and that's been like that from the very beginning. Everything we've done, we've listened and we've acted upon that. So when we actually created the platform itself, all the modules, everything within it has been co-created with NHS staff. So we've got 28 NHS staff champions, we call them, who are fantastic folk across the NHS who've dedicated time to help us develop what we've got on the platform. And so that's continuous user testing, that's looking at wireframes, sketching things out, and getting research looked at as well. So we wouldn't be anywhere without them. So again, a big shout out to everyone that has been able to support us with that. And the last thing I'd like to say is, on the next slide, please, is just circling back onto some of the reasons why people would like to share. And I just very quickly touch on this. So on the left-hand side of the slide, we're looking at what might motivate someone to share. And what we've heard is there are a couple of things there. So one, it's just part of their role. They might be in a role, either it's a dedicated role for a project, or they've got a role which is about innovation, improvement, and collaboration, and it's part of their role to share that. And so that's one thing. So they will just do that. The other part is altruism. Now, across the NHS, you know, I think I've heard a lot of people say this, we work in the NHS because we want to give back, we want to help people. So it's like the very nature, it's just part of what people do in the NHS. So that would certainly be part of the reason why someone would want to share. The other thing we heard is that it's also a recognition piece. It's a recognition for you personally as doing something that's changed something for the better within the NHS, but also it's the team, and more importantly, it's the team actually that have made that change. And it's recognition to that team that you've done a great job. And it doesn't even have to be great results. It could be you've actually learned something through this project. And okay, you didn't get the outcomes you wanted, but actually the learning is actually really important there. So recognition for doing that. And then finally, it's about supporting career progression as well. Being able to capture this knowledge either for CPD purposes, for your appraisal, for just gathering evidence so that you can present that to your manager. All of those things are things that we had that might motivate someone to share their experience of working on a change project. And so just quickly looping back to Bob then, so writing a story on Bob can help solve some of those problems for an author. So as I mentioned earlier, we can help support that local embedding. If someone's conducted a change in a local setting, we can then make sure that's ingrained. So if they leave, it's still there and it can be used, and others can learn from it. You can also report upon the impact very clearly. You can report exactly what change that has made in the system, and others can see that as well. The other part is that because you're capturing it all in one place, it saves those conversations down the line. One thing we heard is that people, when they've done good work, it's shared. People naturally want to talk to them about it, and rightly so. But sometimes that can feel overwhelming if lots of people have contacted you for information. So having all your information in the Bob story can be easy to then say, hey, it's on Bob, check the link out, and then they've already got the lowdown, and then you just have to cover a couple of key bits of the project. And then finally, the last thing to say is that the way that we've structured Bob, it's all about reflecting back on what you've done. So you can use that as a means to collect lessons learned, which we know is really important for maintaining and collecting CPD along the way as well. So we believe that there's some very interesting aspects of Bob that can really help support writers in collecting their stories.
Okay, so thanks, Mark. So our latest story actually went live this morning is one from an amazing person. So Dr. Anu Abaro, and she's a radiologist. She works at St Mark's Hospital, which is the National Bowel Hospital. And she is telling a story about giving a presentation on anti-racism to her trust. So she actually took the opportunity to create a presentation to talk about her experience as living as a black woman, so she basically really did masses of research into the challenges of racism in the UK, particularly looking at the impact within the NHS, looking at unconscious bias, and gave this tremendous presentation. So what she's done is actually unpacked how she went through creating that presentation. It's a really honest account. She is a really wonderful person, and we're really proud of this story. So it was a really good one to read, just to get yourself up to speed and understand what anti-racism is, and looking at the impact of racism on our decision making. So that is live on the platform, so please go and have a look at that story. So the platform itself is, as I've talked about, we have like a self-guided writing engine. So any member of the NHS for free can come and use the platform to create a story on any topic that they want. We ask a series of questions. Now there's a practical demonstration of that tomorrow at 3:45 on the Giant platform. So in this track, in room 5, Nick, who's our quality manager, she will be walking through a demo of the platform and available to take your questions. So if you ever need to reach her, just give Nick an email, and she'd love to have a chat with you about helping you to create a story, so she can talk about the editorial support that we offer. So this is the writing engine. So basically, when you log in, and this is only NHS staff and people that work in social care who can actually create these stories for free and come in and create their stories, is you do a simple sign in, you come through, and basically the writing engine takes you through 3 key sections, and then asks you a series of questions and asking you to give nice, concise answers to those questions. So the that's the writing engine, and Nick, as I said, will give a demo of it tomorrow. Now, in terms of how it visualizes, you can see the stories. You can scroll through all the different parts. And just to draw your attention to 2 bits of functionality within a story, you can actually ask the author a question, and you can also share the story. And currently on the platform, 1/4 of people that read a short story share that story with a colleague. So we'd really encourage you, to share those stories. And I think we are aborting the session, so I think we'll stop. Mark, I think we're stopping.
Okay. If it's not being recorded.
Yeah, well, we're saying here it's dying. So let's cancel.
Okay, fine. Right.
So if this is live, then I'm sorry if you've had a terrible experience. It's not been great for us either, because it's all over the place. The platform's not working very well. So we will come back and give this presentation again somehow if it is live. So thank you very much for your patience. We'll jump off now and find out from the organisers what's going on. So thank you.
You work for the NHS. You've had a great idea, you've made it happen, and it's made a big difference to how we can learn from COVID-19 and enter a new normal. Ideas like yours drive improvement, and they deserve to be shared. That's what BOB does. Amplifying good ideas like yours across the NHS, so as many people as possible can learn from, adapt, and implement your idea. The further good ideas are shared by the BOB community who learn from them, the greater improvement we can achieve.
But actually, I think through these discussions, we might discover that it's not so dissimilar after all. So to kick us off, we're going to hear from the 2 key industry bodies from pharma and medtech. But before we do that, I just want to find out who we have in the audience. So you should be able to see, if you click on the polls tab, there should be a tab there asking what organisation you're joining us from. So if you could just select the answer, or if you don't have the appropriate answer, just pop in the chat where you're joining from. So while we're finding out who you are, let's find out who our speakers are. So I'd like to hand over now to Carolyn from the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the organisation. And then she's going to hand over to Luella to tell us about the ABHI.
Okay, thanks, Chloe, and hello everybody. It's really great to be here. I'm Carolyn Heaney. I'm NHS Engagement Policy Partner at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. Now, the ABPI represents companies of all sizes who invest in discovering the medicines and vaccines of the future. We exist to make the UK the best place in the world to research and develop the use of and use new medicines and vaccines. To do this, we build on we focus on building a thriving environment for medicines discovery, so that the UK is the best place in the world to research and develop new medicines and vaccines. We focus on improving access to new medicines and vaccines so that everyone in the UK can benefit from the latest treatments, and along with enhancing our industry's reputation by demonstrating the high ethical standards we set for ourselves and that society expects. To do that, we are governed by the ABPI Code of Practice. So the industry is self-regulated, and the Code of Practice is a visible sign of our industry's commitment to benefiting patients by operating in a professional, ethical and transparent manner. What the code does is set standards for the promotion of medicines to health professionals and other relevant decision makers in the UK, and it covers interactions between industry and health professionals. It also sets standards relating to the provision of information about prescription-only medicines to the public and patients, and covers pharmaceutical industries, pharmaceutical companies, and relationships with patient organisations. Finally, we represent our members using their insight and experience to communicate how medicines change the lives of millions of people every day. And I work within the NHS engagement team at ABPI, and our role is to support adoption of innovative medicines by acting as a catalyst for partnership, working between the life sciences sector and NHS systems. So to do that, we are involved in doing is enabling, raising awareness of and showcasing collaboration across the system to support shared goals. We play a role in sharing best practice about how to work in partnership, and in driving awareness of the different approaches to governance to enable the sort of collaboration that we believe is most productive. And we also build networks with NHS organisations and leaders and surface the priorities where industry can make a difference, all hopefully with a view to maximising the opportunities that we truly believe that exist from working in partnership in order to embed in innovation in healthcare. So on that note, I will hand over to Luella.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I apologise for some slight background noise. As is working from home, noises happen in your garden without your choice. But anyway, I am Luella Trickett, the Director of Value and Access at the Association of British Health Tech Industries. We're the leading trade association representing medical technologies, diagnostics and digital. We have about 300 members, of which 90% are SMEs, and that figure is very reflective of the industry as a whole, heavily dominated by SMEs. However, we do also have very large multinational companies in our membership, and some of those are represented here today, and you'll be hearing from them. We do a range of activities on behalf of the industry, and very much like Carolyn, we are representing and upholding the reputation of the industry. At this particular point in time, as I'm sure you can imagine, we're doing a lot of work around regulation, what the world's going to look like when we leave the transition period at the end of December. My personal role in the organisation is to champion the adoption and spread of innovation, and ultimately how that is procured by the NHS. one of our big focus areas is on value-based healthcare, really looking at healthcare from the point of view of the patient and looking to deliver outcomes that matter to the patient and to the system. What we're going to be talking about today is very much at the heart of what I'm interested in. Many of you will be aware that at the moment we have the NICE methods and process review underway. That is going to be an integral part of what the future looks like for medical technologies, diagnostics and digital. And coupled with everything that's going on in the COVID world at the moment, I think we've all seen the transformation that can happen. And at that point, I will hand back to Chloe.
So we've got a few different people joining us. The poll doesn't seem to be live, but we've got some Emma from RW Consulting. We've got a couple of other people joining there. So welcome. So obviously, thank you, Carolyn and Luella, for introducing the ABPI and the ABHI. So I'd now like to hand over to our panel members to introduce themselves, kicking off with Dawn.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name's Dawn Tretton. I am Head of Policy and Partnerships at Boehringer Ingelheim.
Morning, everybody. My name's Michelle Sullivan. I head up the Market Access and Health Economics team at Boston Scientific.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Riley, and I am an Area Healthcare Lead for MSD UK. Apologies, I think I went out of order there.
No problem at all. Good morning, everybody. I'm Craig Mustow. I am the Market Access and Government Affairs Manager for Baxter Healthcare.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. So kicking off into the actual panel discussion now, Luella, obviously you mentioned COVID, and it's hard to ignore COVID, even though everyone might be a bit sick of hearing about it. But obviously it has had an incredible impact on the adoption of new technologies. And so first off, to just sort of kick us off, Andrew, I'd just like to unpack sort of what your reflections are from this experience.
Thank you. So, morning, everyone. I think we've seen during the pandemic, both at a very local level and a national level, the way that the medtech industry and pharmaceutical industry has responded and supported the NHS. So at a national level, that was guaranteeing the supply of medicines during the pandemic, so there weren't any shortages. And at a local level, there were partnerships. And I think for me, it was that agility that was demonstrated by the medtech industry and by pharmaceutical companies to respond to very rapidly to a new need, unprecedented need within the NHS, almost to change tack and think, actually, okay, what we were doing 6 months ago, what we were offering 6 months ago probably isn't relevant now. And actually, what new support and new help can we provide, such as getting information out to patients about the new COVID restrictions, about new COVID principles and procedures. I think all the companies demonstrated that both within tech and with innovation. I suppose that agility was the thing that really, on reflection, is the thing that I observed the most.
Thank you, Andrew. And I know, Michelle, you've got some big thoughts on sort of how collaboration has improved during the pandemic as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about what the positives have been from your experience?
Yes, pulling positives from COVID, there's a thought. So moving on from the agility piece, which I completely agree with you, Andrew. The other piece that was so apparent to everybody and is still going on is collaboration, and collaboration in all sorts of different ways. We have very direct and immediate requests all of the time with med devices when we're working in hospitals and supporting teams and supporting cases. And what happened with COVID was we were unable to meet some of those immediate requests in the same way that we needed to. And we had to find ways of collaborating with our customers, of collaborating with other device companies, of collaborating with procurement, of collaborating with those that were running the hospital, and of collaborating within ABHI, actually, to come up with wonderful and magical ways that we could help support and serve our customers. Some of the things that we got involved with at Boston Scientific was such things as virtual reality apps, being able to support cases in real time, virtually, even with very close work. And what this built was a collaborative, we're all in it together approach that personally, and having discussed this, via various groups at ABHI with my colleagues, we're all keen to continue. And we've heard many different parts of the NHS say thank you for us quickly and speedily supporting them in innovative ways. And we are keen to continue collaborating in that way and with each other also.
Great, thanks, Michelle. It sounds like you've been doing some fantastic work. So obviously that's from a sort of medtech perspective. So Dawn, I'd just like to turn to you to kind of find out a little bit more about the ways that, from a pharma perspective, how that collaboration is being approached.
Yeah, so I think one of the great qualities of the pharma industry is our ability to be able to connect systems. So whether we can connect north with south, east and west, and actually drive better conversations between the NHS. It's an incredibly busy time, and actually there isn't always the opportunity to reach out and search for best practice. So it's a real quality, like I say, of working through the ABPI as a collaborative, but also as individual organisations to be able to do this. And we've seen some great examples around pathway changes, particularly in respiratory, where we've been able to connect systems, and this goes across all therapy areas. But I think the other piece we can do as well locally is also connect different parts of the systems. So across, there'll be multi industry collaboration opportunities, and we're all able to work together. And actually, the NHS is now starting to come. Carolyn may talk to this later, but is actually starting to approach the ABPI because they see these qualities, they see the ability of pharma to connect systems and share best practice, but actually bring probably different qualities, a different viewpoint to support their challenges. So for me, that's probably an untapped resource, an untapped opportunity, but we're starting to see some real green shoots of acceleration and opportunity.
Thanks, Dawn. So that's a nice segue into kind of, you touched there on kind of pharma's, collaboration with the NHS and sort of the broader systems approach. So I'd like to turn to Craig and ask, what are your thoughts on kind of how industry currently kind of works to improve the system and introduce new technologies?
Thanks very much. And yeah, there's already been a number of very relevant comments made that I think are going to be a theme throughout this, particularly relating to collaboration and the need to be relevant. So I think a lot of this comes down to really understanding the problem that you're trying to solve and why you're trying to solve it, why it needs solving. And I think part of the challenge that we often face is the term technology or innovation adoption, and that I think has led to primarily a focus on the technology itself. And I think what we need to do is start looking beyond that technology at how we can help deliver greater benefits to both the patient and the system as a whole. And the challenge with medtech is often used in small parts of very large, very complex treatment pathways where you have multiple influencing variables. So we need to start to consider, what do we bring as an organisation to care delivery, rather than just thinking about the impact of the use of a piece of technology at a discrete point in a care pathway. So if we do that, what we can do is start repositioning the conversation towards something that's more solution focused rather than transactional. And I'm going to try and make the point with a very simplified example just for illustration. Let's take a technology, for example, which reduces post-operative bleeding in surgery faster than conventional methods. And let's say that technology takes 5 minutes off a 2-hour operation. So it's quite hard to illustrate the value of that, and it's harder to justify the impact that that'll have on budgets. But if you were to take that outcome and say, okay, well, does that give us the opportunity, because we've reduced post-operative risk, to take that patient through a day case pathway rather than an inpatient stay? There's potentially the chance to send them home earlier. Maybe there's an opportunity to introduce some technology. Maybe there's an app that can help track symptoms at home. And if there's a live feed into the caring physician, then they can make some really quick real-time decisions. So you can start to see how that very simple idea can develop into something that's actually of much greater value than it initially looks. So for me, I think those organizations who are able to really understand the challenges faced by health systems and clearly demonstrate the system value through co-creation of new care models, they're likely to gain more traction than simply developing technological innovation and assessing them as part of a discrete part of an existing pathway.
Thanks, Craig. And leading on to that, and I think you alluded to it earlier, Michelle, but you know, we've seen things rapidly evolve during COVID, and actually focusing on that sort of problem piece. So kind of what are your reflections on how we can keep that momentum going post-COVID?
Well, we've talked about collaboration, we've talked about agility. Craig's given some good examples of looking at the full patient pathway. And through this whole crisis, what I discussed earlier and what is apparent is that we are all working together in new and innovative ways. And not only that, but as has been discussed by the providers and by anybody who's been responding to the situation, we're working in ways that we have never worked before. And so I believe that there can be a level of collaboration towards a common aim of solving some of the big system challenges that have come up because of COVID, which were already there before COVID, but they've been exacerbated enormously, whether that's waiting lists, whether that's workforce challenges and issues, whether that's capacity, whether that's diagnostics and ability to give timely diagnostics. All of these things are part of patient pathways that we could all be working together in new and innovative ways. And that's companies within the med device workspace, that's pharmaceutical companies. We've all got a part to play in the patient pathway and what best practice looks like, and also what best practice looks like in today's world. Okay, you know, what best practice looks like in today's world might be something quite different. We might have things that have moved up the agenda that weren't there before. We all know that we're focusing on keeping patients out of hospital, doing speedier things with them, doing them in settings that are different, making them feel safe and secure in how we're treating them or diagnosing them. And, you know, we're working with a NHS, which is under the cosh and under big capacity and workforce constraints. And we need to be working with them in a very collaborative pathway, supportive way, all together, solving specific problems that have been identified. And that's what we did in COVID. So why can't we do that with some of the other things that have risen to the fore now?
Thank you, Michelle. So I'd like to just welcome Christopher, who's joined us. And so Christopher, if you obviously first introduce yourself, but then if you could answer the question from a pharma perspective, it would just, I know you've got some thoughts on this and sort of the introduction of integrated care systems. So just be good to hear your reflections on how the industry can work together with the NHS better.
Yes, so first of all, apologies that I'm a little bit tardy. I had some challenges with my Wi-Fi router this morning, to put it mildly, but yeah, glad to be with you now. So my views on this are, you know, are fairly, fairly straightforward, I think. I mean, I've got some experience in working in industry collaborations with the NHS where it's worked well. I think quite often clinicians are better placed to initiate collaborations with industry than commissioners are, in my experience. And they see the validity of being able to expedite things more quickly within the system through partnering with industry, which strikes me often as ridiculous, that you know, a clinician or a consultant will have easier route to achieving what he wants for a patient through partnering with somebody out with his own organization than within. And I think that points to, some of the challenges for industry really in engaging with the NHS. I think there's less challenges for industry engaging with the NHS than there is from the NHS engaging with the NHS quite often. And there are a number of anecdotal examples I could share where clinicians have approached commissioners with innovative models of care or pilots that they want to test, where they've defined through looking at data or outcomes a clear opportunity for improvement, but have not managed to garner the support because of competing priorities or over engineered bureaucracy, sometimes, for want of a better phrase, in the commissioning landscape, which has stood in the way of progress. So my personal viewpoint is that the NHS needs to get better at engaging with itself before the relationship with pharma will improve. And point in case, I think we've got PCNs now that are taking responsibility for making clinical decisions on local footprint levels, which is, I think, a great step forward. But they're not recognised as statutory NHS bodies yet. I think probably something that would be useful from a national level for industry engaging would some sort of definition around how industry engage better with PCNs, because up until this point, if we do wish to do that, it's typically through a sort of third-party relationship with the trust, for instance, that will sort of broker that engagement. But that's kind of my viewpoint. Hope that's useful.
Thank you, Christopher. Andrew, I'd just like to turn to you because I know that you've got some quite good examples of how the NHS is actually tackling this approach in a sort of innovative way. So could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think it goes back to Craig's point, really excellent point about focusing on the problem and having a clear idea of what the problem is. So there's been a couple of examples nationally with the Vanguard programs, and then at a regional level where the NHS has used a kind of a governance structure in terms of like an industry challenge. So where they've defined a problem and said, this is the problem, this is our parameters, what's in scope, what's out of scope. We would welcome, almost like a tender basis, we would welcome approaches from industry who have a presence in this market to basically submit proposals that they think would provide solutions towards this larger goal that they've articulated. And again, it's like I say, in the Vanguard program, that led to quite a few companies engaging and delivering large-scale projects. On a regional level, it's led to me being involved in a joint working project. And what I liked about it was it had that equity across all companies. So all companies were able to have the transparency to be able to apply if they wished to. If they didn't want to, they didn't have to. It gave the customer that kind of probity and governance structure that they knew that they were doing something in a transparent and appropriate way. It was all compliant with the ABPI rules and regulations and kind of shaped by their joint working framework, and very much fell within that and was guided by that. And like I say, it's led to successful outcomes in terms of projects that have helped deliver benefits to patients, to the NHS and to industry, kind of that golden center of the Venn diagram that we're all working towards. So yeah, I think there is examples there that academic health science networks or ICSs in the future can utilize to basically have a framework to with identified opportunities to encourage collaboration, which is Michelle's point, and to keep that going. So yeah, I've had a personal very good experience of that, and happy to share offline more details if people wanted to get in contact.
Thank you, Andrew. And that's a really interesting example. So I'd like to just find out a little bit more from Luella if you've seen a similar thing happen in medtech and health tech, and what your thoughts are on that approach.
Absolutely. I mean, it's almost the core principles of value-based healthcare, actually trying to deliver a solution that is system-wide beneficial. We often talk about the adoption of innovation in the context of something shiny, big, new, and expensive, but actually innovation is about changing the way you do things as much as changing what you do those things with. And collaboration that we've all talked about already has to be part of this. And again, reflecting on the COVID experience, there wasn't one silver bullet. You needed diagnostics, you needed therapeutics, you needed medical equipment in intensive care units. You needed all of the people coming together to deliver the treatment plan for the system as a whole. And so I think what we've seen is industry collaborating with industry partners as well, because if you're trying to solve a solution across a pathway, chances are no one single company has all the solutions. We tend to be specialists in our own field. And therefore, if you're a specialist in one bit of the pathway, isn't it better to go and work with another specialist rather than trying to become good overnight? And I think we've seen a lot of that happening. I think the other thing that we need to remember is the NHS prior to COVID was very, very siloed. One of the things that we've seen the change through COVID is the removal of the barriers. And that's removal of the barriers from a financial point of view as much as from a technology point of view. And that is where you're empowered to actually deliver a pathway solution, because you can spend money in one place to benefit another place, which I think all of us collectively agree has been one of the barriers to the adoption of innovation historically. So we've just all proved that it can be done. Let's use this silver lining, this little tiny silver lining, and take it forward. Thanks, Chloe.
Thanks, Luella. And that leads on nicely, actually. You've talked a little bit about what you're doing moving forward and how we can actually keep this momentum going. So Carolyn, I know you've got several things that you're working on moving into 2021 to showcase the value that pharma brings. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thanks, Chloe. And this is a really interesting discussion, isn't it? And what's striking me is what Dawn said about the sort of cross-fertilization that pharma companies and medtech companies are able to help with in terms of sharing insight, bringing insight from one area of the system to another, either within a system or across different systems. And what Craig said as well in terms of working within a pathway and sort of just bringing a different perspective, what the external person can bring in terms of the perspective on just a different way to think about things. And there's a huge value in that. And so we really have worked hard to support industry to generate the strategic partnerships, which we believe is the best way to improve outcomes for patients and in the future. And we are constantly building on the thriving agreements that we already have in place, which between our industry, the NHS and other system partners. And ABPI itself has memorandums of understanding with Birmingham and Greater Manchester, which are both examples of where we are creating a framework within which pharma companies and NHS systems on a geographical basis can work to improve the health of the populations across that geographical area. We also have a partnership agreement with the AHSN network, through whom we're working in partnership with the network as a whole and with individual AHSNs as a channel for supporting partnership working between pharma companies and NHS organisations across their different patches. And we also have a partnership agreement with the NHS England focused on diabetes to help industry, so that industry can help deliver the goals of the National Diabetes Strategy. And that's just a few examples. We've also recently undertaken an exercise similar to the one that Andrew described around the NCA, but with NHSX, where we facilitated a call to industry from NHSX to support the delivery of services through remote monitoring and remote delivery, and the sorts of things that have emerged as being particularly valuable in the context of the pandemic. So that's the sort of thing that we are doing at national level to support the sort of joining the dots between organisations and supporting the dialogue that is valuable to take place. But the other thing that's key is actually showcasing what is happening between NHS and industry and what the value of it is. So a key thing that we are currently doing is working towards the development of a repository of examples of NHS industry cross-sector collaboration, so that we can build and share information about specific projects that have demonstrable successes and the demonstrable successes and improvements that they have generated. And for the first time, once we have brought that to fruition, it will enable access through a single portal to scores of tangible examples of projects that have been delivered by the NHS and pharmaceutical industry partners across our member companies, demonstrating at organisation and system level how industry can contribute to the delivery of NHS priorities across the UK. It's all about ultimately delivering a triple win of improved patient outcomes, more efficient use of NHS resources, and evidence of impact of industry. And so we really hope that by bringing people's attention to and sharing quite how much activity is going on in terms of partnership working between pharma and then the NHS, quite how much is going on, and the value that it brings in terms of the benefits that it brings to patients. We're really passionate about that, and are extremely enthusiastic about sharing those examples and working with people to understand how we can help people learn from them.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's great to hear from a sort of national perspective what's happening across the pharma industry. So I'd like to now drill down and come back to Dawn. I know through your career you've seen this big cultural shift in the way that pharma works with the NHS. So just be good to hear a little bit more about your experience and thoughts on that.
Yeah, I won't say how many years I've been in industry because that will definitely give my age away. So I'm not going to do that. But it's true to say, having come from the NHS originally and stepping into pharma, it was a big cultural change. Pharma were the big bad organisations that pumped expensive drugs into a system. But actually now it's really taken a step forward, and I'm genuinely seeing a massive, culture shift in how the NHS wants to work with the industry. There's a genuine need and desire. I think the secondary parts of that is really important, to create and co-create solutions that, I mean, Andrew touched on it, this triple win. So creating a win for patients, creating a win for the NHS, and actually, quite rightly so, a win for industry, because medicines alone won't solve a challenge, but working together and creating wraparound solutions, whether that's digital, whether that's collaboration with third-party organisations. MedTech, actually, we're starting to see more collaborations there. And some very simple digital solutions are actually starting to come to the fore. So I am definitely seeing a sea change. And I think from an industry perspective, we have to keep driving that co-creation and that triple win conversation, because the value that we can bring, whether it's skills, data analysis, project management, and actually understanding the NHS, working with the NHS, I've already said, to connect systems, is really impactful. And what we're starting to shape now as well is a reduction in health inequalities, because we're supporting the NHS to think differently about how they access patients who wouldn't ordinarily hit the system. So there's been a 30% reduction in activity because of COVID. So there's a lot of work in industry working with the NHS to think about how we can reach out to those patients. So that requires a different type of thinking. That, we're talking social prescribing, we're talking risk stratification, it's beyond the medicines. And you know, I credit to industry for thinking outside the box and doing things in a very different way, but also credit to the NHS for actually really taking on the partnership approach and wanting to work with us. So I see a really positive future, and unfortunately for many, COVID has accelerated this, but it's just shown how we can work effectively together.
Thanks, Dawn. Some really interesting points there. Craig, from a medtech perspective, you know, what have you seen in terms of working together with the NHS in this different way?
Yeah, I think a lot of the challenges are actually fairly similar. I mean, it was a really interesting point that Dawn made about looking beyond the drug, and as I said before, I think it's very for medtech as well. But I want to come back to the point that Luella made around nice, new, shiny things and the way that healthcare is procured, because I think these two things are potential barriers, and I think things are starting to change. So value doesn't necessarily need new, exciting, high-tech innovation. I think that's the sort of first point I want to make. I think payment by results has created a bit of a challenge whereby, you know, activity drives income. So decisions made around technology is often focus on reducing cost versus a set tariff, rather than necessarily looking at the net impact, the net value impact on the system. So I think as the payment system starts to change, and we're expecting that to happen, we're expecting it to go more towards a blended payment model over the next 12 months. And as integrated care systems start to develop, I think there's going to need to be a much clearer understanding of the cost of delivery of care within a defined financial envelope. So understanding the net impact that a technology can bring is going to become really important. And I'm going to give another example, just to try and illustrate this. So the example is it's a combination of medicines and medtech. Currently, there are around 40 million doses of IV infusions prepared aseptically on wards each year from drug vials. And the time taken to do that is estimated at around 4,000 whole-time equivalent nurses just in England. And this is at a point in time when there's obviously fairly serious constraints on the NHS workforce. So if you could introduce a licensed, sterile, ready to administer version of those doses in a bag or in a syringe ready for IV administration, that can have a really significant impact on patient safety and in freeing up time for care. But because we're talking about effectively a generic drug rather than, say, a new active substance, it's likely to fall through the cracks of any kind of formal health tech assessment process, and therefore miss out, for example, on things like funding mandates. And therefore it's unlikely to be assessed based on its value, and it's most likely to be seen as a cost, and the cost of procuring it is likely to be more than the perceived cost of administering it, you know, on the wards. So as a result of that, I think organizations may not have the appetite to develop those kinds of products if that pathway of adoption isn't there, even though such a simple, in inverted commas, product could solve quite a substantial issue. So I think any value-based healthcare system should be able to really understand and extract the value from that product and then apply applicable funding to that, so that something so simple can actually be quite transformative. And I think to do that, I think as an industry, I think we need to be better at illustrating that value and articulating the value. I think the NHS needs to be better at procuring value. But I do think that because new integrated care systems are developing, because of the way that funding and reimbursement looks to be changing, I do think there's a genuine opportunity to do that, to look beyond the drugs, beyond the technology, and to think, as Luella said, about innovation as more than just the technology itself. It's about what it can deliver and how it can solve problems. And I do agree with Dawn as well that I think there are improvements. This has been a conversation we've been having in the industry and in the NHS for a long time, but I do think that there are some chinks of light that do suggest some improvements going forward.
Thanks very much, Craig. Some really good points there. Now, very quickly, I've just got one more question for Christopher, but I'll ask you to be snappy because we want to be able to answer some of our attendees' questions. But I just want to ask your thoughts on how we can actually work to build a better value story. I know you've got some thoughts on this around modelling and things, so it'd just be good to hear your perspectives.
Trying to come off mute. There we go. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I do. So I think sort of reflect on industry a little bit and our approach. Quite often we're marketing led. Quite often we're very brand led as well, and we focus quite heavily on messaging around that. And I think industry needs to progress beyond the pill, I think is the kind of quote that gets banded around a bit. But what that actually means for me, you know, if you think, so I used to work in consulting environment, what we used to talk about was approaching any problem in sort of cyclical fashion. So you'd sense the problem, you'd then go out and seize the problem, and then you transform and you'd revisit it, and you continue that sense, seize, transform loop. In pharmaceuticals, we jump straight to the end very often. So we'll go straight to seize and transform, to use that analogy. Whereas what we should really be doing is thinking about sensing the full holistic environment, you know, out of a particular pathway of which our medicine is only one component or one treatment of probably a myriad that a patient on in that pathway will be on. What other factors influence them? You know, is it their ability to take the medicines, or their compliance, or their attitudes, or education? You know, are there bottlenecks in the system that analysis or data can point to that they don't get, patients don't get appropriate or timely review? You know, can we shine a light on that sort of stuff that allows for a broader, more MDT type discussion across a health economy, and can lead to more, I guess, sustainable probably and impactful changes that don't just look at one small part. And I think it's on industry. We've got a lot of capable people, and we've got a lot of experience in analytics. But I think it's on industry to kind of take that on and yield it in anger better to try and drive results that are focused on the full health economy.
Thanks, Christopher. So we've literally got 1 minute left. I'm going to come back to Michelle and ask had a question from the audience saying, what do you think is the key driver for successful collaborative work?
It's going to be a real basic, but it's communication and building a network and thinking laterally and outside of the box. And we all do this in our industries, right? We all have started in various different places. You know, I started as a sales rep, and what I had to do was go in to operating theatres and build relationships with the team that I'm working with, and then come up with ways to help them do what they're doing better. And now we've got to stop focusing on that little micro world and start thinking about doing the same thing, but in a bigger world where we're thinking laterally all of the time, solving problems, but communication and keeping those communication lines going and working to common aims is going to be the key of doing this successfully. You know, not getting distracted and not getting put off by things that go wrong sometimes, and just focusing on the goal and communicating with each other all of the time. This is what we're trying to do. This is how we're trying to do it. What's the next thing we've got to do? Who else do we need to work with to make that happen? And growing it like a big sprawling network of communication and action to achieve these things that we need to do. Because we all know, right, that coming up is a really difficult time, and the system is going to need us all to work together in this way to make sure patient care and patient outcomes aren't negatively affected going forward.
Thanks, Michelle. Beautifully summarised. So we're at the end of the session. It's been a very short one. It's one that we could continue talking about for hours, I'm sure. I think the key things that have come across, as was evident in that question, is collaboration is absolutely fundamental to getting adoption, and finding these new ways of working and looking critically at ourselves as well, as industry and what we can be doing better. So I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. Sorry we didn't manage to get through everybody's questions, but there is obviously the rest of the conference you can explore. We've got plenty more sessions. There's also the networking area, and hopefully all of our speakers are happy to sort of network through Giant on there, and you've got all your profiles on there, so you can, if you want to speak to any of our panelists, you can find their details via there. So I just want to finish by saying a massive thank you to all our panelists today, and yeah, we look forward to welcoming everyone on the rest of the sessions.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Chloe. See ya.
You work for the NHS. You've had a great idea, you've made it happen, and it's made a big difference to how we can learn from COVID-19 and enter a new normal. Ideas like yours drive improvement, and they deserve to be shared. That's what BOB does. Amplifying good ideas like yours across the NHS, so as many people as possible can learn from, adapt, and implement your idea. The further good ideas are shared by the BOB community who learn from them, the greater improvement we can achieve. You made a change. Share your solution with others. Speak to BOB.
Live. Just like that. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session today, titled Getting Innovation to Stick in the NHS, Organisations Successfully Locking in Innovations in Light of COVID-19. And I'm here today joined by an esteemed panel of speakers, and I'll introduce each of them now as we go through. So the first speaker we have is Dr. Rachel Grimaldi, and she is an NHS anaesthetist and also founder and CEO of a unique digital communication platform called PardMedic, which is a communication tool improving communication in frontline healthcare. And Rachel has a long-held interest in patient safety, human factors and communication, and has actually been awarded several awards for developing a safer ICU handover. and she's been awarded most notably the international, I'm going to mispronounce this probably, and apologies, Shahid Haran Prize at the College of Anaesthetists. Sorry, I probably completely butchered that, so apologies. And then we also have Catherine Davis, who's the managing director of Monticle, which is a consultancy that helps companies to get their technology into the NHS and into the front line, where it makes a real difference to the NHS, to patients and staff alike. And she helps health tech companies build partnerships with the NHS and helps them unlock the funding they need in order to grow and scale. And Catherine's also got a background as a health regulator, so really helps to understand in depth all the different parts of the health system and how they work and what they're trying to achieve, and also the pressures that people are under and the regulatory regime that they operate in. So an interesting background there. And then we're also joined by Dr. Abdullah Albayati, who is a doctor with a wide range of skills and interests. Currently, he's a general practitioner in Leeds, but also wears several other hats, two of them. So CEO and co-founder of a couple of other companies, My Clinic, which is a free compliant telemedicine platform that allows patients to connect with doctors via video, and also Medical Chain, which is a way to securely store health records and maintain a single version of truth, and that uses blockchain technology. And both of those have had a lot of use during COVID times, and I know we're going to cover off that in this session. As well as that, Abdullah is also an NHS clinical entrepreneur. Then we move on to Mindy Dashner of Dashner Consulting. Mindy's background is a vast background in management consultancy, working for some of the world's biggest organizations, having founded several businesses, both startups and within multinational companies. She now acts as a change agent to help support and shape and evolve businesses and solutions to bring value to them. And she works across Europe, Asia, and the US. And Mindy's very keen to see more collaboration and discussion regarding new models of healthcare integration and services. And she has first-hand experience to the complexity of new care models and what they can present, and the opportunity they hold for transforming patient care and improving the healthcare economy. And then I don't know if Paul's on the line right now, but he is going to be joining us shortly. But we've got Paul Charnley, who's the digital lead for Cheshire and Merseyside Health and Care Partners, and also co-chair of NHS Blueprinting Steering Committee. Until recently, he was the director of IT and information at the digital exemplar Wirral University Teaching Hospital. And as part of that global digital exemplar, the hospital is aimed to be a fully digital hospital by 2020. And he has more than 35 years experience in health informatics, having worked for the National Programme for IT and Northwest and Cheshire and Merseyside Strategic Health Authorities. And last but definitely not least is Ian Fletcher. And Ian is currently Senior Programme Lead for Blueprinting at NHS. And he's overseen the development of blueprints all the way from concept stage all the way through to having an established methodology for creating and sharing them. And he's going to talk a little bit more about blueprinting later on, but there are now 150 live blueprints written by more than 50 NHS trusts, helping other health organisations digitally transform more quickly and more cost effectively. And before joining the GDE programme and blueprinting in 2017, Ian led the National Communications and Engagement of NHS England's primary care services. So without further ado, I'll just jump into what we're going to be talking about. And really today is about talking about how innovations stick within this time, but also it's looking at the lessons learned during this pandemic, and particularly what changes we think might come out of it on the other side. But before we go into that, I just wanted to quickly flag a couple of other programs that are relevant in this space, and that's the RESET program and also the Beneficial Change Network. Unfortunately, people from both those organisations weren't able to join us today, but being that both these programs really deal very closely with looking at lessons learned throughout this this pandemic, and really looking at how to lock them in and ingrain them in the system and change things going forward. So we're going to pop a couple of links about both those programs into the chat here today, so you can have a look at those. But the summary is that the Reset program really is about, and this is an NHS Confederation campaign, and it's really there to look at what the system should look like after this pandemic, what that looks like, and how we rebuild services. And really the idea of Reset is to reset the ambitions of what health and care system for the future could look like. And the Beneficial Change Network is similar but different, looking at 16 work streams in NHS England and NHS Improvement, and it's about capturing and sharing those collective learnings across the system. So similar but different, but both have that great intent to try and learn from what's happened, learn from all the changes that have taken place at pace, and see what that could look like in the future. So what we're going to do shortly for everyone watching here is we're going to be posting a poll into the poll section. So to access the poll, you need to actually click on the tab that says polls to be able to answer that. And that should just be underneath or by the side of the speed of the video that you're viewing. So I'll just flag that there. So that should be available, and we'll have a look back at the end of the session at some of the responses there. And I'll remind you again midway through to just go there and complete the poll. So what we're going to do then is jump straight to some discussions with our panelists. With everything in mind and what we've just spoken about, I'd like to maybe start off with looking at some experiences of how companies and innovations that have maybe gained traction during COVID times that maybe hadn't beforehand, or maybe had and maybe weren't as visible, and particularly looking at what kind of innovations were most people were most receptive to, and why. Was it staff challenges? Was it dealing with virtual challenges or backlog challenges? And maybe we could look at why certain companies' innovations got stuck and others didn't. And I'm going to aim that question at Catherine Davis, if I will. Catherine, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on some of those
okay,
points.
gosh, that's a great place to start. Yeah. So I think the context to this is quite important, because there's actually been a huge amount of really interesting innovations this year. But I think if we could just cast our mind back in the mists of time to January 2019, NHS England and Improvement published a long-term plan. And the reason I think this is quite important is because the innovations that we've seen this year didn't sort of fall out of the sky in an unexpected way. They're part of an evolution. And to understand how to get innovation to really take hold in the NHS, you kind of need to understand a little bit about the context. So I thought I'd just touch on that briefly. So the long-term plan was envisaging digitally enabled care going mainstream across the NHS in the next 5 years. So that was very much the direction of travel. And so, for example, the long-term plan talks about digital primary care, digital outpatient services, senior clinicians using digital tools more effectively, when people are ill, being able to be cared for at home, self-management guided by digital tools. So I think it's just important to flag that, because that was already very much the direction of travel within the system. If we think about something like primary care, so at the beginning of this year, the data that I've seen says that 90% of appointments were face-to-face. And now we're seeing 85% of appointments being done remotely. So a massive, massive change already. So a lot of those ambitions in terms of digitization in the long-term plan have really, really been accelerated this year. I think the other thing that's interesting just to flag is that there were a number of major health conditions that were also highlighted in the long-term plan as being of particular importance within the system. And they included cancer, cardiovascular, stroke, diabetes, respiratory disease, and adult mental health. So those were the sort of condition-related priorities for the system. So then if we kind of fast forward to this year, to 2020, I think there were sort of 3 phases of COVID in terms of a system response. So the first phase, everyone was in shock and trying to do the best they could in a very difficult and uncertain situation. So the real priority there was to free up the maximum possible amount of inpatient and critical care capacity in the system. And primary care practitioners were told to triage patients before their appointments, ideally via an online consultation. So that was the first sort of phase, I think, of the system response. And that led to a number of innovations that I'll come back to in a second. The second phase was later in the year, where the system was told to restart non-urgent elective care. And we see a term that started to be used then, referring to locking in beneficial changes. And that then comes up a little bit later as well in communications to the system. So in the second phase, people were told to lock in technology-enabled service delivery options. And then all the meanwhile, obviously, dealing with COVID and the pressures of COVID. And then we get to sort of the third phase, which is about an accelerated return back to near normal levels of non-COVID care while still treating COVID patients. So I think within that kind of context, you see some really interesting innovations start to emerge. So to call out a few of those, I mentioned virtual GP appointments already. There was already a route to market for providers of virtual GP services through the GP IT Futures framework. So we see companies like iPlato, DrLink, Accurix really starting to scale up the provision of online GP appointments. And then we also see the scaling up of virtual outpatient appointments. That had already begun, and some trusts had already started to see patients remotely. But then when NHSX entered into an agreement with Attend Anywhere to grant a license to all NHS trusts to use that technology for 12 months, it then became possible for trusts to access that technology. We've also seen really interesting things happening in diagnostics, and I think that's as a result of a massive backlog that's been caused in part by pausing activity earlier in the year. So we've seen really interesting things, for example, in radiology for the more advanced trusts. We've seen, for instance, the partnerships between radiology providers in the East Midlands and Chiron in relation to breast screening, where they've worked out how to triage people who haven't been seen so that they can prioritise treatment for people who need it most quickly, which I think is really interesting. We've also seen very interesting developments in teledermatology, where cancer pathways have changed so that people can get a diagnosis with the assistance of artificial intelligence in the community, rather than being referred by their GP along a kind of traditional cancer pathway. So very interesting things happening there. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, there's a lot to say.
There's loads. No, it's fascinating. I was just going to say, actually, and I don't want to be negative on this, but I wonder in terms of some of the key challenges that have been faced, I'm just wondering what they might be, what you've seen those to be.
I mean, I think, so there was a response from lots of innovators to things that were happening across the system. And I think the key challenge is commercializing those initial responses. A lot of innovators have provided their services free of charge, and they now need to work out a funding model so those can really be embedded and implemented going forwards. In a recent paper that NHS E&I published talking about innovation during the pandemic, there's a part at the end when it says funding for these innovations is still to be decided. So what's going to happen?
That's interesting. And if I can open it up, I don't know if there's anyone else on the panel. Okay, let's go to, I believe that's Mindy. I've got a small bit. Yes, Mindy, please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I think Catherine has given a good summary, and in some ways I was kind of living and breathing some of this, particularly because I was involved in digital triage, both in pilots with 111 and then into the primary care and the delivering actually online consultations with it. And the one thing I would like to say in scale is whenever the NHS comes alongside and really creates a funding mechanism, which is what they did under the dynamic purchasing system for what they called e-consultations, which comes in a variety of buckets of whether that's digital triage or some of the online consultations. It spurred a market in advance of actually the COVID. So it created opportunity and it did spur competition. In some ways, there was lots of competition and things going on also with the NHS app going on that was creating some confusion at the time. But what it did do is it kind of jump-started something in advance and created a funding mechanism for that. That's incredibly important, I think, in leadership with regards to NHS and how they may look at doing some of this moving forward to create the opportunities. COVID was a kickstart for sure, because even though there were some funding mechanisms, actually the time to put a funding mechanism in and actually get the system to begin to procure and actually understand what they're procuring and changing the behaviors, that is the crucial point of difficulty around that, is changing the system. And there's a lag in that. And COVID just forced it. It just forced it overnight. So those are some interesting things. And I think some of the things that Catherine had also said, it created this unique ability around some things. We're doing things digitally within the mental health, within the diabetes, and some of that was just a natural extension of how do you do more with less.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm going to move on, but we can pick up some of these themes a little later on. Thank you. We're now going to look at, and this is a question aimed at Ian and Paul. And what we'd like to do is really look at how have you seen people utilise knowledge sharing and other mechanisms during this time from a blueprint perspective. We have some slides actually, which we're going to post onto the screen. Hopefully they'll come on soon. And then Ian and Paul, if you're able to maybe answer that question with some of the details that you've got there, giving a description of blueprints.
I've been having a few connection problems, so I hope hopefully you can hear me.
Hear and see you loud and clear, Paul.
So yeah, I'm the co-chair of the steering group, and Ian will introduce himself as the program leader for blueprinting. We've set out to capture knowledge from a whole range of digital projects over the last 2 or 3 years as part of the Digital Exemplar program.
Oh, we've lost Paul. Ian, are you able to pick up on that?
I will.
Please.
Yes. It's going to be an So morning everyone. I'm Ian Fletcher, the Senior Programme Lead for Blueprinting at NHS. And as Paul was saying, I mean, this has been a journey now for about 3 years where we've taken a concept that if initially came out of the Global Digital Exemplar Programme, where all of the 50 trusts on that programme were given some funding from the centre and asked to really capture their best practice. And as part of their learning and kind of them being at the leading edge of some of the technology developments and digital work that was going on, what we wanted to do was really bottle that and use it as a golden thread that we could then share that learning to other parts of the system. And we work with all of those sort of 50 trusts, which range from acute, mental health, ambulance providers, to really sort of capture the essence of the story of what they've done in terms of digital transformation and done well. What we had to do originally was take the concept and turn it into a methodology and something that would be as easy. So what we did, we did some piloting work initially, and then we created a set of tools and templates effectively, which really just told a story. We brought it down to sort of on a really kind of human basis that we all respond really well to stories, don't we? People don't like to sort of see lots of kind of technical data and documents. They want something that tells a story of a journey, and this is what the blueprints capture. So they will talk about how a particular trust or health organisation has got a particular problem and issue. They've done some pre-planning work, they've done the implementation, and they've started then to monitor and look at what the benefits and the outcomes have been. And each of the blueprints tells that very sort of structured story, but thrown into the mix is that we have a range of different artifacts and top tips that people can kind of delve into and see some of the real detail, or they can see, the step-by-step guide for other organisations to come along. And what we're hoping it will do is at least give people a real head start. It will allow them to see how others have learned from their experiences and mistakes they've made along the way, and hopefully avoid those mistakes themselves and save some sort of time and resources in doing that.
That sounds great, Ian. And I just wanted to say, I know that there were a couple that were kind of accelerated through and put up on the platform because of COVID. I don't know if you were able to talk to that at all.
Yeah, so and again, just as context for people this morning, so we've got nearly 160 blueprints, and they've been developed pretty much over the space of 2 years. So you can imagine, this is a process that takes a little while because a trust has got to write it, it's got to be quality assured, and then approved by the steering group and uploaded. So it's not something that somebody's going to do in a couple of weeks. However, with COVID, and as Catherine and Mindy have spoken about already, this really kind of accelerated the process. So when we were asked by colleagues NHS that was going on with video consultations, we worked with Imperial and how they implemented Attend Anywhere. So that was one of the examples. And this was part of Imperial's plan to reduce outpatient appointments by 25% over 4 years. So this wasn't a new initiative in that sense, but obviously what happened was it went into overdrive because of the physical restrictions and the health risks around COVID, and obviously people interacting with health staff. What they needed to do was put a lot of this stuff into video consultation and their efforts there instead. And they managed to get around 3,000 staff at the trust set up with Attend Anywhere and able to securely access that system and talk to patients in about 8 days. Which is a pretty major achievement for that trust and for all the people and supporting staff involved in that. And I know from talking to colleagues at Imperial that they certainly feel they've learned a lot in having to do that. Also, strategically, it's taken them along the route they wanted to go along anyway, and it's actually given them an opportunity to do it and obviously do it and embed it more quickly.
That's great. Thank you for that, Ian, and thanks for covering Paul's details there. And I'm just going to keep it moving on, just conscious of time. Interestingly, we've spoken about primary care up top. Catherine mentioned it was mentioned another time, and actually just want to look specifically at that and actually looking at what makes things stick in primary care. And I'm going to go to Abdullah here, and maybe you could talk about your experiences of providing your service during this pandemic. I mean, what have you learned? And maybe if there's some time to talk about beyond the UK, because I know your platforms are offered outside of the UK as well. So maybe talk about what those experiences have looked like outside the UK and if they've been different, and if so, why.
Yeah, so thanks very much for the introduction, Mark, and the other comments in the group. I mean, obviously, COVID has been a big injection, a boost into the arm of health technology. I think as medical professionals or as a health profession, we're quite risk averse, and we always want to see evidence-based medicine or proof of concept before we can actually take on board things. So this can sometimes create a bit of a glacial approach to getting technology embedded into a system. I think in primary care, what's been done well, or will hopefully be done even better in the future, is that there's frameworks on board, trying to show companies that this is the conveyor belt system you need to get on if you want to be if you want to showcase what you've been doing. So, for example, there was one before which is called the dynamic purchasing system, and that was for online providers to get on. That's now evolved in something called the GP Futures Health Desk, and even then, that name is being changed as well. So sometimes it's a challenge for companies to stay on top of what these things are being renamed as or labeled as, but the principle is the same, that there are these frameworks that you want to try to get on board, especially in primary care. And you've got great concepts such as the AHSN, which is all about the academic health science networks. And I think if companies work closely with them, then that's the best way to stay abreast of these changes to get the innovation in primary care.
That sounds great. And what about your experiences from outside the UK? Is there anything there that's been very different from the UK, would you say?
Yes, I think we're very blessed in the UK that we had 4 or 5 telemedicine systems ready to go, Attend Anywheres, the AccuRx's of this world. So when the pandemic hit, we were able to grab this off the shelf, plug this in, use this. There's a little bit of infrastructure and practices. So when I'm working as a GP, for example, I was using my dictaphone as my microphone when I'm talking to patients, even though they can't necessarily see me because I didn't have a webcam. So you're trying to do the best that you could. What we found personally, so with our system called My Clinic, is that we realized there's so many people that have been left behind though. So our biggest users on our platform within the UK were dentists and social workers that didn't necessarily have logins to these other systems, but they also needed to self-isolate, or the patients were isolating. And on an international level, we were used in 72 different countries, because you realize they're not as privileged as we are in the UK, that you have all these systems which are for free. So we realized there was a lot out there that needed support and needed supplying. And I think we're probably in a similar position to Rachel, and with the great work that she's done, is when COVID came around, you just want to get things out there, and you set up this kind of freemium model of just get it out there and get people testing it. And now the challenge is, okay, so what is your baseline product, which is going to be for free, and how are you going to justify and fund all the premium features you're going to add on? So we've had great traction, I'd say, outside more than within the UK.
It's interesting. And actually, yeah, it's a really good point, actually. And I'm wondering, actually, if we can flip to Rachel, actually, now, because I think it'd be interesting to hear the sort of kind of the secondary care perspective on some of that, because I know that you launched Cardmedic in the midst of all of this. And I know that it's been launched for a little while now, but now things are changing. It's now a new focus, and there's new things that you're learning about, I guess, to get stickiness in the system. And some of those challenges that you might be facing now could be quite interesting, I think, to hear about.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark. And yeah, very much echo, everybody else's points around the pandemic really being a catalyst for adopting digital innovation in the NHS. And as Catherine was mentioning, this is off the back of the long-term plan. So it's definitely been in the pipeline for a while, but the pandemic has certainly accelerated it. I found when I launched, it was simply in response to a need to be able to communicate, frontline healthcare staff to communicate with patients through PPE was the initial idea that inspired it. But actually, good communication in healthcare is, it's a forever problem. It's been around long before the pandemic, will continue to be around long after the pandemic. And what Cardmedic does is bridge a gap in service provision for patients who have visual, hearing, or cognitive impairments, or a language barrier, or PPE. So, as Abdul mentioned, we put it out there as just something for free. I honestly thought, I'm just going to do this to help some friends. I launched it within 72 hours back in April, and we've had 45,000 users in 120 countries and 16,000 app downloads in that time. And then just, touching on kind of Catherine's point and Abdullah's point as well about, now commercializing, it's figuring out, this needs to be free for patients and staff, but it also needs to be sustainable. So it's kind of working through how we make that happen and what the commercial model looks like. And we're working on a licensed subscription model and having different tiers of subscription and then different features within those tiers and functionalities. So I think, for us, the focus is now shifting towards, we're uploading the sign language videos, we're uploading the easy read content, we're expanding upon the functionality and accessibility, we're integrating AI technology into the platform as well, but also working out how to commercialize. And most of our users are 63% are in the UK, 17% are in the US. So we're focusing on UK and US markets at the moment and have lots of connections in those spaces. But it also has potential to expand into other verticals, and we're speaking to the UK Ministry of Defence as well. It's essentially trying to figure out, kind of carving out that path of making this a really cost-effective solution, because it's unique, it's innovative, it's very much needed. But I want it to be a really positive social impact and reduce health inequalities. It can't be a really expensive solution. It has to be able to fit into really neatly into people's budgets. So that's the kind of path we're navigating at the moment, if that helps answer that.
It does. I wonder, does anyone else have a perspective on some of those challenges that Rachel's mentioned there around kind of that stickiness and I guess the change of direction now, so that the great uptake, but then also looking at right now, what next? And maybe either Catherine or Mindy, I don't know, from your perspective of working with other companies.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to loop back to this point about funding, because I think it's so important that we have to fund these innovations if we want to see innovation in the system. So there are lots of organisations that are in the same situation as you, Rachel, where they've demonstrated that they're able to add value to the system. They can help patients, they can help staff, but they'll just run out of runway if we can't get funding into the system. So I think really there's an opportunity for everybody in the health tech community to come together and have a conversation with the centre about how we're going to fund this change. Because if everybody needs to have bilateral conversations with individual NHS organisations around the system, it just won't happen. And we talk about locking in beneficial change. If we really want it to lock in, we've got to make it easier for people to spread innovation by helping them understand how people achieved it, who have done it successfully. And we really need to get the funding into the system at scale so that innovators can really embed their technology.
For me, that feels like music to my ears, because I've received Innovate UK funding. I've had 2 grants from Innovate UK, and I'm actively fundraising at the moment with investors. But this is, communication in healthcare, as you said, is it's everywhere, and this is a solution that impacts primary care, secondary care, tertiary care, pre-hospital care, pharmacies, dentists. It can reach absolutely everywhere. So to have that kind of top level approach of how do we get this funded, how do we get this widely adopted, it's really hard to penetrate that space from a kind of innovator's point of view. Sorry, Mindy, I'll let you chat.
Mindy, that's great.
Yeah, I think probably this is a very interesting conversation for whoever's out there listening to us talk. I think commercialization is often considered a bad word or a naughty word within the NHS, just because it's not meant to be offensive. It's just kind of fact. But in actuality, a lot of the NHS is actually privatized by the nature of the organizations that support it, and even primary care to a certain degree. So it's important to understand the basics of some of these things. But I do think that the commercialization aspect of companies is very, very important, and how that's talked about. Oftentimes that's sponsored directly by VCs, and if you reach a certain scale, private equity. But there is a known fact here in the UK that a lot of VCs in early stage do not like to fund organizations that their main supplier is the NHS, because of the time it takes, the effort to get in, and all of that. And I think we are now at a state, particularly with COVID, it's shown that, and where we're going, that there is a direct equation to health equals wealth. The healthier we are, the more productive we are, the more as a nation we make. And we're entering probably a huge recessionary period where we know there's going to be strains on funding within the NHS. But sometimes the only way out of these constraints is through innovation. So I think there needs to be some type of focus around that, and it needs to be important. But I do think there's a lot of companies out there struggling with commercialization that don't really necessarily have a specific problem and an ROI that they're focusing on. And I do think there's 2 bridges to gap. Yeah.
Absolutely. I just wanted to flag at this point as well to say that actually Rachel has actually written up a couple of impact stories on Bob as well. I think the link has been posted in the chat as well. So if you work in the NHS, sign up and check out those stories where Rachel and others are sharing their experiences of actually using the carbon medic solution. But I just wanted to go back to Mindy again and to elaborate on some of the things you were saying, because the other thing is Mindy created a great report, which I believe the link is in the chat as well, so you can all go and read that. And I think from there, I think it'd be interesting to look at, because I know you looked at some of these things as to why innovation stick, what it was. And you mentioned that it requires an attitudinal change to get that. And people are changing. They're changing the way they embrace innovation. Catherine mentioned that. I thought every speaker's actually mentioned that. And there's more prevalence of it in everyday life. And I was just wondering if you might be able to elaborate more on some of the kind of the key bits that you got from that report that might be interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. I would be delighted to. To a certain degree, the report was spawned from a lot of the challenges I faced, when I was very much involved in working with the NHS. I've been an entrepreneur, and a lot of that is almost predominantly all been in health technology. But it was traditionally within the private sector, because they make decisions faster and their commerciality is so acute. Whereas sometimes with the NHS, the people that you're actually procuring feel a little bit disconnected from the commercial realities, because that's often center funded around that. And really, I did it to get an understanding. I recognized that COVID was such an enormous change within the NHS, all healthcare, and every individual. And what I wanted to do is get a pulse on it. So I did a report that covered about 150 senior people within healthcare, both from the NHS, also private and health tech. So I didn't want to narrow it to one, to really get an understanding of what they see as some of the challenges and the big areas within that. And I think what came out loud and clear was that COVID has made an attitudinal change across the board. And the attitudinal change is healthcare is a laggard in using technology, almost of every industry. Maybe not education, maybe not law, maybe they're on par, but it is a laggard. And what COVID has forced, because of the virtualization and the need to have more flexible workforce, changes to happen quickly. People didn't have a choice; they had to change. And what the system saw is, actually, we can change. We can change quickly. And I think there was also unconstrained, the ability to make maybe decisions a bit more locally and not so much pressure from the top, created interesting dynamics, which I think a lot of people embraced. Perhaps maybe not the speed that they had to do it, and there's learning come out of it. But attitudinally, I think there's been a shift there, whereas time, not my responsibility, don't have the right skill sets. It's just like, we got to do it. Necessity is the mother of all inventions. When you got to do it, you can do it. And what kind of came out of that, I think, is really some really interesting things. And I think we're seeing some stuff that is in health tech, but I also think it's really interesting things also coming from the center. So there needs to be center and a lot of regional things. But kind of the big things coming out was the really need for data and real-time data. The NHS lacks that. And a lot of the decision making, particularly around COVID and capacity, showed a lot of that, and the need to change and have a better handle on that. So I think we're going to see data and how we make decisions around data evolve over the next 5 years rapidly. The other side was the virtualization and the diagnostics. I mean, one thing I will say, and this is a credit, the NHS has just recently announced a deal with GRAIL, which is around this blood testing for cancers. That has the potential to reshape in such an enormous way and be preventative. So it's not just about digital health, it's about lots of different technologies around that. But this is really what we're seeing, is a real shift to sustainability, prevention, putting more things in place. It's early steps and it's early stages. But COVID has rapidly fostered that. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you very much, Mindy. Sorry to cut you off there at the end. I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. The poll results. Also, we've had a couple of questions come through, which I want to try and get to before the end of our session. So the poll results, unfortunately, I can't show you the results. I'll just tell you. So we asked the question to the audience: what do you see as COVID-19's biggest healthcare legacy? And so the response is that the biggest response we had was actually changed working practices forever. Second to that was accelerated use of virtual care. Then we had slowed down adoption of digital health was there. And then the last one was jump-started digital health revolution. And actually one of them didn't actually get a response at all, which was the point around eased use of digital health apps and mindfulness. So that's interesting. And I don't know whether or not there's any very quick reflections on that. Any surprises there from anyone on the panel want to comment on?
I think from a primary care perspective, there are a lot of positives to take from the remote working which we've been doing. There's a lot of benefits we've had both from the patient and the clinician's perspective of not needing the patient to drive 40 minutes to come to an appointment, try to find parking, struggling to find parking, wait in the waiting room for 25 minutes, speak to the doctor for 5 minutes and out the door. So I think there's lots of things that we are doing. I don't think we're doing it in an efficient way yet, because patients are still receiving random phone calls when they're not expecting it. And I think we need to get a lot better at allocating times to patients, creating a kind of virtual waiting room, a virtual queue where you'll get to somebody when you can. But I think it's definitely the early steps there, and we need to just do things a lot better, which tie in logistically. I think one of the challenges we have, just to end on this point, the technology always gets blamed, and it's not the technology's fault. It's the logistics of how you're deploying that technology, and that's what we need to work on.
Very good point. Very good point. And I'm just going to quickly flip. We've got 3 questions here. Let's see how many we can get through. So this is a question here from Fiona Willis. Thank you. How does the panel think they'll be able to encourage older users to engage with new technologies? Who wants to take a stab at that one then? Is that Mindy? Yes, Mindy, go ahead.
I'll do it because there's some evidence coming out where I was before that actually people often skew this to millennials. I'm firmly in the middle-aged category, but I think but above. But what we did see on a lot of the virtualization, digital triage, and there's a huge concern that the elderly will be left behind. And I think within healthcare there is a multi-channel approach. There's not a one-size-fits-all for sure. But it's surprising the amount of older and elderly people that pick these tools up. Yeah, I mean, they're already using them to communicate with their family because of the distance and not being able to see in people in care homes and all of that. So I think there is a little bit of a misnomer that the elderly won't and can't use these type of tools. And what we're also seeing, and I think this is the fundamental thing, and I say this again as part of Dashner Consulting and almost everything that I like to get involved in with regards to digital tech or innovation, we are in the age of the consumer. It has to be convenient. It has to be easy to use, and it needs to be engaging and fulfill that. And healthcare has traditionally been set up for clinicians and consultants in buildings. So this is a fundamental change, which I would almost call a rupture that's going to be happening, and it's going to be painful. But over the next 5 to 10 years, we will see a complete difference. And I also think we'll see how money follows a patient differently, which will radically change some of the processes. And I'm sure Ian's probably involved in some of that and has got a lot to talk about.
I'll let Ian go. We've got just a flag for everyone that's listening as well. We are due to finish at 12:45. I've been told that we can go over by a couple of minutes. If speakers, if you're okay with that, we can do that. We can answer maybe a couple of questions.
Apology, sorry. I was just going to follow up Mindy's point and say again, I think that the view about older people not connecting or not engaging with technology isn't always being borne out, and I think some of the work that we during COVID, and they introduced an app where, for obvious reasons, they didn't want lots of patients going into healthcare settings, but it was actually better to keep them at home and keep an eye on their condition at regular intervals. And the early results from that again have been pretty promising. And I suppose what we have to consider is obviously that's working for a particular, we'll kind of keep reviewing that, but it seems to be working that approach. I suppose what we always have to be careful about is still thinking about the digitally excluded and not just lumping in, not going for kind of generic groups of people, like talking about the middle-aged or the elderly or younger people. Obviously, you know, we need to be more sophisticated about that, don't we? And there's a greater degree of segmentation needed. I think sometimes we do tend to talk in generic groups, and I think that, you know, we're all guilty of doing that. And actually, people's needs are quite complex and multifaceted.
Absolutely. Thank you both. I think maybe let's try one more question, because there's two. Actually, we've both up and they're related. So we've got one question, which is funding of digital innovation reimbursement is absolutely key. Which organisation within the NHS is responsible for this? And then a similar but slightly different, but it's a funding related question, is do you think there's a possibility for NHS or CCGs to reduce or relax regulations in the future, so to attract investors for VCs for funding? So similar but not quite different. Let's go with the first one, the funding of digital innovation question. Any organisations that you would go to and say, yes, absolutely, that's the one to go to for this? Catherine.
Yeah. So just quickly, so unfortunately, lots of people are responsible and then no one ends up being responsible. That is part of the problem. I think NHS is really trying to get this to work better. So I think having more conversations can be very helpful, so we all make sure that everybody's on the same page. And I think this relates to the second question as well. So we're spending public money, so we need to make sure that we're allocating public money in the most sensible way. But it is such a shame if VCs and other investors see on someone's business case that they want to work with the NHS and then they just don't fund them. That's not good for anybody. So I think we need to have more conversations with investors and VCs and NHS X to actually start this dialogue to say, this is what we need to see to be able to invest. It might be priorities, it might be funding going to particular bits of the system. And if we see that, we'll be willing to invest. And then also innovators then wanting to go with a direction of travel and innovate in the areas that have been articulated as priorities. And I think if we could do that a bit better, it might help with some of this reimbursement challenge.
Absolutely. Before we look to wrap, does anyone else have any other comments on those points around funding?
Hi, yeah, sorry, just to add on to Catherine's point there, having spent the last few months actively fundraising and speaking to investors and VCs, and I've got a pitching event tonight actually. So in terms of how they view the NHS, you know, very much echoing everybody's comments about NHS is slow to innovate and slow to uptake, and they don't see it as a kind of viable commercial stream, you know, revenue stream. But where which is really disappointing, obviously, but where they do see it is, you know, they understand that as innovators, if you manage to innovate in the NHS and you do get uptake, albeit slower, it's a blue badge of honour, as you know, then you can kind of go overseas with your blue badge of honour, and that helps. The other kind of frustrating part is they want letters of intent, but NHS trusts don't like giving letters of intent. So you can say, you know, I've got these things in the pipeline and trusts I've spoken to, and they want to do pilots, or they want to pay for. I have 2 trusts, for example, who want to pay for a license subscription model in their new financial year because they're merging, but they don't want to supply a letter of intent. So it's really tricky. You kind of get caught in the middle. So you know what I'm doing has huge amount of promise and potential, and but it's difficult being pre-revenue and speaking to investors because I'm kind of stuck between angels and VCs needing, you know, a lot of upfront investment to invest in patients and the sign language, but you know, and to kind of get out there, but actually long term, you know, the return on investment is potentially huge. So you're sort of stuck in that no man's land, and until, you know, I start maybe getting traction through actual sales, it's a tricky space to be. So yeah, it would be great if you could go and knock on one door on the NHS and say, look at this idea, everyone's using it in the NHS, now we just need some kind of uptake and funding for it, but it just hasn't, you know, it doesn't work like that.
I was going to say one of the things that the NHS probably could do better is to stop changing the goalposts, because for innovators like us or entrepreneurs or startups, you know, every time they say, okay, now you need this ISO certificate, now you need to get this clinical safety officer on board, now you need to jump through this hoop, that's 10 grand, 10 grand, 5 grand, 10 grand. And that money you spent, the first 20K, has already gone in the bin because it's irrelevant anymore, those standards you were aiming for. So I think one thing is obviously trying to get money in one way for us to use and to build, but the other way is we've got to stop taking the money at the other end and try to stop changing the goalposts and say, this is the standard and this is what you need to meet.
Well, listen, I think I'm sorry, Mindy, I'm going to have to draw it to a close now. I think my lessons learned was 45 minutes was never enough for this kind of conversation. I mean, that's for sure. And, you know, the one thing I would say is, first of all, thank you very much to all our speakers for sharing their experiences. And you can find them all, they're all online, LinkedIn and so on, if you wanted to connect with them. Like I said, the card medic story is on BOB.health if you'd like to have another look at that as well, to read that story. And I guess just very quickly, just wrapping up, interestingly, the key things we've heard, and I didn't maybe expect it to come out as much, was a conversation around funding models and procurement was definitely one of the things. If we're looking back at what locks in innovation during this time. The other thing was making sure that these lessons learned really are lessons learned and they are actually communicated and shared and actually used during this time. And the third thing I would say is, let's not get too fixated around the tech. It's not just tech that is, you know, that's innovating during this time. There's many, many other things that could be very useful that we could learn from during this process. I mean, there's probably thousands of other things I could say, but those are the 3 quick things that I've captured. There's been many more. So I'd like to say thank you very much to the panel for joining and contributing to this. And yeah, and we'll leave it there. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
You work for the NHS. You've had a great idea, you've made it happen, and it's made a big difference to how we can learn from COVID-19 and enter a new normal. Ideas like yours drive improvement and they deserve to be shared. that's what Bob does. Amplifying good ideas like yours across the NHS so as many people as possible can learn from, adapt and implement your idea. The further good ideas are shared by the Bob community who learn from them, the greater improvement we can achieve. You made a change. Share your solution with others. Speak to Bob.
Everybody to our final session of today on the Bob track, which is all about spreading and scaling of innovation and improvement in the NHS. We're very much focused in on that topic here today in the room. My name is Neil Crump. I'm one of the co-founders of BOB.health, and I've got two tremendous speakers, people I really respect what they think and what they say. So I've got Hugh and Rob, who are going to talk about how we drive improvement and innovation, the adoption of those to achieve spread and scale within the NHS. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a second, but first of all, I've just got a couple of little things I wanted to run through. So first of all, I just wanted to make a distinction between sort of homegrown improvement and which doesn't really have any external support or sort of extra things going into it, versus innovation, which is potentially, my definition for this session is sort of privately funded things that are introduced into the system to help make the change happen. So I'm not saying that improvement isn't innovative, but there are some distinctions between, you know, making improvements to the system and then introducing an innovation into the system, which is something that's been externally developed and being brought in. So the other thing I just wanted to run through is we have a poll. So I'm just wanted to see if that's coming up. I don't see it there yet. So what we'll do is I will skip the poll for the minute. I'll come back to that. But what I would ask you to do is there were some people tweeting. So you can tweet on the hashtag Giant2020. And the hashtag for our track is unpack the how. So unpack the how with a hashtag in front. And Bob's Twitter account is BOB.health with spelled BOB.health. So spell out the word dot. Please join us on the conversation there. So Hugh, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Neil.
Lovely.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So if you could just introduce yourself, tell everyone about your current role and remit, and maybe just your career path to how you got into this role.
Okay, thank you, Neil. My name's Hugh McCackey. I'm the National Director of Improvement. I started this post about 18 months ago in April last year. Little did I know it would pan out the way it has. And certainly the role has changed probably quite significantly from what I saw at the outset. Prior to this role, I was a chief exec in an integrated trust, a health and social care trust in Northern Ireland, and indeed had been working for probably the previous 25 years at sort of board level and various posts. My particular interest and, in fact, passion is about patient safety and improvement and essentially making services safer and better. That was my particular interest and bent. In the 10 years prior to this post, I was a chief exec in a trust, and I spent that 10 years trying to embed an improvement approach into the organization. And I said at the outset of when I was appointed, in fact, I said at my interview, if you appoint me, I will want to change the way we judge success and try and build a different way, which had improvement embedded into the organization. And that's what we spent 10 years doing, and our results were really good. We didn't set out to fix performance, but by embedding an improvement approach and culture, We moved to being sort of first or second in virtually everything in Northern Ireland. Our reference costs were low. Our staff satisfaction results were really high. I think the biggest single impact was probably the culture change, and where staff right across the organisation felt they had the skills, they felt empowered, they felt they had permission to try and make their bit of the service safer and better. And we had a little mantra, which is one which I've sort of brought with me, which there were 10,000 staff in the organisation. And we used to say regularly that the idea that the top sort of 20 or 30 people had all the answers and could see all the solutions is a nonsense. And actually, if we could harness the 10,000 minds or the 10,000 pairs of eyes to see how we could make our services better, we would be much more powerful. And that's essentially what we set out to do, which was to try and change the culture and the whole approach in the organisation. Not long before I left, I visited a ward where every band 3 was trained and was leading an improvement project. So your sort of healthcare assistant or your that sort of level was leading and felt empowered to do it. And the sense of satisfaction people get from that. So in long story short, in essence, the reason I took up this job was to see, can you do that? Can we do it with 1.3 million people? Can we embed an improvement approach and culture right across the NHS in England? Because I think a lot of our frontline staff feel beleaguered, feel like there's an awful heavy focus on assurance in our system, and I think we need to rebalance that with a culture of improvement. So we go back to people feeling they have the skills, and they're celebrated and supported whenever they make their service safer and better.
That's amazing. And I will pick up. I had not picked up on the fact that your previous experience was integrated health and social care. So maybe I might pick on that. And if actually anyone in the audience has any questions about that integration, because obviously we're not terribly good at that within England. I think better in Scotland and obviously in Northern Ireland. But if anyone has any questions about social care and how you link that in, please send those in. So thank you. So now, Rob Berry, would you like to introduce yourself, your role, and how you got to this post?
Certainly. Thank you, Neil. Thank you for inviting me to be part of today's session. So I'm called the Head of Innovation in Kent, Surrey and Sussex Academic Health Science Network. What that means in practice is I spend a lot of time talking to companies. So myself and a small team deal with the sort of first contacts of companies who approach RAHSN. And we provide twice monthly briefings, a little bit about the NHS, some of the challenges you'll face, the sort of support services AHSNs might give you, and how we might signpost you to different agencies and programs across the innovation landscape. There's one of me per 15 AHSNs that covers England. Collectively, we're known as the Commercial Directors Forum. In that sort of forum, we pick up some of the national work. So I'm involved in what's called the Programme Development Group. This is looking at, out of those 15 AHSNs, interventions that have been developed locally may have a national application. So we're involved in collating and curating those to turn them into national programmes. In that role, I've supported the drafting of a framework around real-world evaluation, real-world validation, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later on, but an essential step to supporting scale up. I've been involved in the Small Business Research Initiative as a board member. It's a NHS England programme that invests about 10 million a year to develop new technologies to address known challenges. And I'm also involved in helping the Accelerated Access Collaborative develop innovator services nationally. How did I get into this? So some years ago, not quite 30, I joined the NHS at Great Ormond Street Hospital and worked in typically acute provider organisations for about 17 years. And in that role, it's a general management role, supporting frontline services and support services, clinical and non-clinical, to improve. So often this comes down to understanding how a decision's made How are the books balanced in order to support those changes? Shortly after leaving, I think it was Guy's and St Thomas's, I was working in the Strategic Health Authority in the South East Coast, as it was called then, similar territory to Kent, Surrey and Sussex that I'm in now. And then 3 years after that, started in an academic health science network. I was involved in the development of the guidance that supported the national rollout, so involved in some stakeholder engagement around the development of AHSNs, and have been there for the last 8 years.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And I just want to say thank you to Rob, because he has been very helpful with Bob and helping us to sort of navigate the system and giving us some great advice along the way. So he and his team have been brilliant, and we enjoy working with them. So thank you for being here, Rob. So the poll is in fact working. So the question on the poll is, and you can access the poll, there's a button that you'll see that says poll next to the chat button. And the question is, why is experience sharing about improvement and innovation adoption so hard in practice within the NHS? So why is that so hard? There are 4 options. People are busy. There's no standard way to share. What is shared lacks practical tips, and staff move on. So you've only got 4 options. But if you have other ideas, please drop that into the chat. So if it doesn't fit those 4, drop it into the chat, and we'll see what comes up there and see what that reveals for us. So let's have a look. Let's move on, and we have 2 presentations from each of our speakers. So Hugh is going to go first. So Hugh, if you'd like to kick us off with your presentation, we'll have a reflection, and then we'll go on to Rob's presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. I don't know whether people in the sort of audience know, but I'm presenting without being able to see my own slides in real time. So I'm working off a sort of a separate screen, sort of hard copy. So hopefully if I move off sync, Neil can tell me, and I'll get back on sync with the slides, in case I'm talking to a slide and you're looking at a different one. It's interesting, Neil, your question there, you gave 4 areas. I think there's another one which is actually around almost the cultural aspect. And I think it's links to part of what I was saying earlier on, which is around how do we build, and links to the title, I suppose, of my talk, which is how do we actually build an NHS which is keen to share, one where we encourage and value sharing of innovation and ideas that work, and actually that we put a high value on adopting things that work. Because I know we were talking just beforehand, and talking about one of my sort of ambitions is to create an award for harvesters or adopters. That we have lots of awards for people who do the innovation or who do something for the first time. But actually, I think part of the issue for the NHS is not that we don't have the solutions, we don't have the innovations, but we take so long to spread them. And we actually are not good at getting that comprehensive scale and spread. And the potential benefits that could be realized if we were much better at scaling, at sharing, at borrowing, taking ideas from elsewhere, because I almost think we're culturally, whether it's from the market, the years of the market and competition, that we're keen to hide our innovations and ideas. But also we're not necessarily receptive to receiving them. And I think we've got to relearn a behavior which is very much that we're keen, we're hungry to harvest and adopt things that work from elsewhere. And I suppose that links to my title slide, which I mentioned in terms of my Twitter handle. I'm passionate about making services safer and better. And I think at a national level, and deliberately the title is about driving improvement and innovation adoption. So the key word is about adoption to achieve scale and spread. And there is something around, I think, rebuilding that culture and some of the systems, and showing that we value that that approach and behavior of actually adopting things that work. So move on to the next slide, which is, I want to sort of use this very relevant example. It's entitled Approach, Adopt and Adapt. And it's a very relevant example. I'm not going to go into all the detail of it, but it was the process we used through the sort of early stages in the last few months as part of the sort of recovery from wave one, and was what we had termed the Adopt and Adapt process, but essentially is a rapid improvement cycle. Where on the basis of a sort of pulling together the knowledge we have and the ideas we have around a challenge, taking one area, in this case, we had each region taking one area, whether it was outpatients, whether it was theatres, whether it was diagnostics, and working up what was the best way, what needed to be done to maximise our recovery. And involving the relevant ICSs, STPs, and local systems, and developing a sort of blueprint solution, a sort of what we felt was a plan, if you like, out of that piece of work. But then sharing and collaborating that with the other regions, so that the work done in, for instance, the Northwest on outpatients, that blueprint, we didn't have 7 consecutive or 7 sort of workshops going on at the same time, trying to find the same solutions to the same problem, and potentially coming up with slightly different. But we had it done in one area, potentially, and we did have with some where other regions attended or other systems attended. And then we shared that and had a system for sharing that, and had built in the sort of local ability to adapt that to a local circumstance. So it may be very different in the Southwest, or it may have some difference in the Southwest from London, for instance. But the overriding principle was one where we were collaborating and sharing, so that we were building on the improvements and building on the plan, rather than reworking and finding the same solution a second time. If we could move on to the next slide, which should be entitled the Improvement Directorate. And this is a piece of work we've sort of been doing over the last number of months to say, well, what is the role of the National Improvement Directorate in a sort of post-COVID world, and looking at what are the big objectives for us. And I've essentially distilled this into 3 areas. The first being the sort of recovery piece. How do we actually use the skills, the improvement skills that we have? And particularly we have a sort of lead role around diagnostics and outpatients. How do we use that sort of things from the National Outpatients Programme and Diagnostics Programme? And how do we use the other sort of work we're doing with areas like GIRFT, for instance, to help recovery? And a big part of that is sharing the learning around what works, sharing the innovations, sharing the improvements that we know will work, using data to identify where those opportunities exist, and then supporting the local area and systems with that recovery. The second area is entitled, as you can see, productivity, but this is a bit like, you will remember, some of you will remember the sort of the artist formerly known as Prince. Well, this is the sort of national program formerly known as productivity, because I think at this time, if you talk to frontline staff about productivity, it means, cost cutting, it means sort of taking money out, it means sort of driving already busy people even harder because we have to get our productivity up. But in actual fact, I believe the approach to which works is if we focus our attention on getting, if you like, that embedding improvement and embedding pathways much more consistently, And it's interesting, I know one of the questions you were sort of asking was around the sort of difference between improvement and innovation, or and there's, I think with innovation, some of you may well have read black box thinking. A big bit of the black box thinking is when you're innovating, you increase variation to try and find the things that work. And actually, when you're embedding, using improvement tools, you're often, and particularly with the productivity approach, is what you're trying to do is embed the right way of doing it much more consistently, because that's a big part of our problem. Is not that we don't know what the best pathway is or the best care is, but we don't do it all the time. So how are we much more successful at embedding the right way of doing things? And if we do that, we remove waste in the form of harm, unnecessary steps, unnecessary tasks for staff, unnecessary interventions, unnecessary treatments, and that has a very significant impact, and it gives us better quality, better outcomes, better patient experience, but also releases time for staff. And it's by reducing the variation in our pathways. And that's in essence what the big central piece of that program, formerly known as productivity. And we will find a better title. It'll be something like Pathways to Better Health or something like that. But we need to actually build a program around that, and that's what we'll be doing over the next number of months. And the third area, which I'm not going to go into, is what we would term recovery support, or the old special measures. But for me, a lot of that is pinned by a range of areas around data, measurement, tools, and things we have learned over the past 6 months, 8 months through this period. But ultimately, it is about embedding a continuous improvement approach as the norm. That can we spread this approach to 1.3 million people and really embed it right across the system. So moving to the next slide, which is clarity on focus and responsibilities at each system level. And I'm not going to go into this, but I think we have a grid. You can see there that I think at each level, there is a different role and responsibility in this. And I think we have to move, and I think there's a real opportunity with the moving into a system led by systems, if you like, system leadership, and bringing together providers, commissioners, local authorities, agencies, into a system-led approach. I think offers us great opportunity. I don't believe that actually structures deliver results, but I think a structure which can help or can inhibit you from delivering results. And I think this structure will give us greater potential, where nationally, instead of trying to introduce things or trying to scale things to 230 providers and then potentially primary care and other areas, instead, actually that's been led by the 40 or so systems. And actually, I think the spans of control become much more manageable. So I think at a national level, our role is not to mandate, not to try and direct and manage into the system, but is actually to create the opportunity to set the tone, to clarify the big objectives, and to create the framework for that to happen. And as you can see, that then percolates down to each level. If we move on to the next slide, which is sort of is a slide taken out of the sort of, and it's entitled Overview Our Approach from the National Outpatients Transformation Programme. And I think it sort of captures what we're trying to do now at a national level, is not to mandate here is the way to do it, but is actually creating the guidance, the tools, the resources, and bringing together the relevant stakeholders to help to identify what are the optimum pathways, what are the tools that are useful, what is the best practice, who's doing well, what are they doing, how can we create the framework for that to be shared. And then, if you like, the middle box is around the implementation of that and testing of it. The local adaptation has to be based at a local system level. And then on the right-hand side is very much the sort of basing that in a number of specialties where we will prototype. And I think for me, the approach we're likely to take next year is focusing on a small number of specialties, but trying then to really get, because this isn't just we haven't done it before. No country has really internationally yet has embedded, taken a system of embedding pathways and made it work at scale. And so what we want to do is actually sort of model this and prototype it at 2 or 3 specialties or pathways, so that we can actually demonstrate that the methodology works. And I think the time has never been better to do it. If we could move on to the next slide, which will be very briefly, and it's a sort of, it's a graphic. And for me, this is how will this work is now at 4 levels. The first, which I shared with actually a group this morning, and they probably quite rightly said the digital transformation piece at the top should actually probably be right at the bottom and underpinning everything we do. I sort of described it as overarching, but actually I think there's a strong argument that it's underpinning. We need digital, to use the digital tools to enable us to make the transformation we want right across the system, but it should be embedded as business as usual. The second level, which is what I've just been talking about, the national programs or interventions and optimum practice guidance. And I think in the past, each one of those boxes, the sort of workforce, diagnostics, outpatients, the national programs, have all been working in silos. So we try to manage the diagnostics down into the system across 230 providers, or cancer down in across all the system. And actually, if you're on the receiving end, you have all these national programs and optimal guidance coming at you. And our ability then to get all of those things embedded has been effectively compromised and hasn't been that successful. The third level is actually what we're intending to do is to take those things, and in the way we talked about the rapid improvement type approach is in a particular system is to embed that into a pathway. So they're taking the clinical pathway and designing it based around all of the interventions, so that it's the pathway that we're then adopting, not each of the separate programs. And the bottom piece is very much what the optimum pathway should look like, but will be implemented and owned at the system level. And the ability for us, if we, for instance, on this one, if we look at something like ophthalmology, if we embed the different things that we could do, particularly around, you can see there, the advice and guidance, patient-initiated follow-up, the interoperability with optometrists and opticians. We have roughly 8 million outpatients at the minute. We can offer a different way to do that for somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of those patients, so that we can do it in a different model. And that's the prize for us. If we could move on to the next slide. This is a slide about, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but it's one which Helen Bevan would use a lot, and it's sourced from Henry Tim's New Power. And it's actually about the approach, and it goes right back to the start of what I said, is the old power was essentially a sort of top-down approach. It was about command and control. Authority was held by a few, and it was pushed down into the system. The new power, and this is researched, and Henry Timms talks about the sort of new power in the 21st century, but you will also see lots of other academic papers, and you will see the best organizations in most sectors now are ones which are agile, ones which have empowered staff, ones which have clarity about the objective and the outcome that we're wanting to achieve, but people right throughout the organization delivering on objectives much more horizontally. If we can move on to the next slide, which in fact you can skip over that one onto the next one, which should be the same one but with an arrow. And this is a slide from the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, and it actually talks about the journey we've been on around and talks about the sort of 3 levels, or 3 sort of loops in this journey, or 3 steps in the journey. And almost coming from a culture where we've performance management and heavy assurance, and it's actually about almost retaining power at the center. And it was very much the noughties and even the 90s that emerged and became very prevalent. we've had a period now over the last 5 years or so around, and longer for some organizations, around quality improvement, where and what might be described as sharing power in organizations, where we're trying to, what I talked about trying to empower many more people in the organization. But the third step in this journey is very much around how do we actually co-produce and mobilize social action much more with people, patients and staff. And if we can move on to the next slide, because that leads me into what I describe as reciprocal innovation, and the practice, if you like, of exchanging insights and learning and ideas for virtual or sort of for benefit and improvement right across the system, and the potential for us to shift the relationship, particularly with citizens, and to engage citizens, which, if you relate back to the IHI model, is that third curve that they talked about. If we could move on to the, and sorry, just in the middle of that graphic, you can see the traditional sort of innovation led by experts is quite a narrow funnel. It's a typical sort of innovation journey. And the one which on the right is one which I'm going to say a little bit more about, but is this idea of co-producing and engaging citizens much more. And the idea where you can broaden that funnel and actually engage many more people in innovation and have greater opportunity for that to be embedded. We, if we can move on to the next slide, we used that approach in the early stages of the COVID outbreak to look at, in particularly laboratory testing. How could we upscale our testing? As you will recall, how could you forget the desire to increase our testing levels? And so we used a platform called crowdsourcing, where we went out quite openly and offered with industry, with some champions on a sort of social media platform where people could put their idea in, people could add to it, people could discuss it, and it was a very open platform. It was very agile, and we literally got hundreds of ideas. We'd 5 problems we'd set that we needed solutions to, and invited people to come. And if you think about that versus the NHS's traditional approach for generating innovations and building on them and implementing them. And the result was we had quite a number of those ideas went into production within a matter of weeks, and added to the sort of testing levels that we had. So very powerful in terms of an agile innovation sort of approach. So the next slide I have, which should have a picture of Facebook, and but was this idea of how we can actually increase our reach to citizens, to create sort of much more around this, what I would term the reciprocal learning. And it was a piece of work, again, we did with NHS Horizons, and using what Facebook would call the power administrators or power admins. And by working with those 1,800 power administrators, we were able to reach 5 million UK citizens because of the power of social media and the ability. But you are not able to control the message and mandate the message as much. It's the power administrators actually tend to theme that and adapt it. But they connect, if you like. You get the message out in a way which reaches a huge amount more people. If I can move on to the next slide. And this was just really some of the results that we had. There was, sort of the extremely positive feedback was sort of vastly outweighed any sort of negative feedback. People felt that the message was much better connected to their communities and the communities that, if you like, they represented or connected with. And not surprisingly, people then felt an awful lot more supported or minded to support the NHS and felt motivated to do so. And so as a new platform for us, moving away from the sort of traditional engagement process, I think there was quite a bit of learning, as the title was saying, reciprocal learning. If we could move to the next slide, which I hope, if I'm keeping pace with what's on the screen, is a picture of a woman called Maureen Bisignano, who's one of my leadership she would be a leadership role model for me, and has been involved in improvement work and patient safety work for probably over 20 years now, and incredibly value-driven leader. But Maureen, one of the things Maureen talks about, which is something I agree with very much, is that everyone in healthcare having two jobs: to do your job and to improve the job or the service that you're a part of. Not in a heavy-duty way, that staff are left feeling, gosh, I've something more to do, but actually that you're feeling you have the authority, you have the permission, you have the space to actually add to and improve and make your job safer and better. And it goes back to those 10,000 pairs of eyes and 10,000 minds. Move on to the next slide. I know you were due to have someone to talk about Accelerated Access Collaborative. I'm not going to, other than to say it does exist. I sit on the board, and it's a forum which is bringing together industry, government, regulators, and the NHS together to try and speed up innovations and bring innovations and improvements to the coalface, to the front line, much more quickly, so that we're identifying and scaling innovations that will help us in a more agile and effective way. If we move on to the next slide, what it looks like, that just gives you some of the sort of 6 main areas that the Accelerated Access Initiative is working in. I'm not going to go through those. They're there in the slides. I'm very conscious of time. So I'm just going to finish with some final sort of reflections from me. I think it is very much around how do we create, and I'm not going to go through these, but just to maybe sort of go back even to Neil's question, why did I take this job? And I think there is something around how do we create across the NHS a culture where it is much more aligned with new power, is one where there's a greater agility to improve and to innovate. And we have a sense of the balance between assurance and improvement. And if you like, we're trying to harness the 1.3 million minds and 1.3 million pairs of eyes. Because if we do that, delivering on the objectives in this new power model, we will bring innovations to the front line, and the benefits of those innovations and improvements much more effectively, with all the benefits that we'll get from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. That's awesome. So I think what's lovely is you can definitely tell that you've done this as a job. So it's not just a lot of theory. You've been at the front line, you've rolled up your sleeves, you know what you're talking about. I do think the cultural piece is hugely important, that kind of the new power, and just people who, as you kicked off saying, people are feeling a bit downtrodden and exhausted and asking people to do more. But I think obviously people get a real buzz from making a positive change in the system. And I think that, we really do need to celebrate people that go the extra mile, and really want to make the difference. I just want to flag tomorrow, we have a session at 11 o'clock. So for the people listening, if you scroll down on the screen, you'll see tomorrow at 11, we actually have a group of NHS frontline staff, a real mixture of people from medical student through to doctor, to talk about practically how you go about sharing, and what are the barriers and what encourages you. So real looking at that cultural piece from a frontline perspective. And at midday, we have a team to speak about kind of the theories behind sharing, what encourages people. So we've got a digital sociologist, behavioural scientists, and some other experts to talk about these topics. So those will be really interesting and give extra flavour to what Hugh's been talking about. So thank you, Hugh. Rob, I don't know if you've got any reflections ahead of your presentation on what Hugh just said.
Yes, very briefly. Great to listen to Hugh talking about the work of NHS improvement. So what stood out for me was just how vast the challenge is. The task at sort of national level of where to start, what structures and process have you got to bring to bear. Great that re-emphasised, as we do in our briefings to companies, the number one priority is patient safety. So again, just great to hear that sort of message being reflected out. In terms of the poll, I had a slightly different view, and I was reflecting on our sort of role as AHSNs. The innovation landscape, or the improvement in innovation landscape, is huge. And sometimes when you're in dealing with a particular part of it, you have a strong view of your particular perspective. And I'm hoping I'm not going to contradict anything that Hugh said. I agree with everything he said. It's just sometimes when we're focusing on, as I will later on, technology, there are slightly different rules occasionally that come into it. My thoughts on your poll was linking into Hugh's comments about sort of culture. And in our briefing, we refer back to the Health and Care Act of 1990. So we've now had 30 years of a process that started with that act, which was focused on organisational efficiency. So the main point of that act 30 years ago was to get people to own their organisation. And we've had successive sort of policies, including around trusts and foundation trusts, that have driven the ownership and responsibility for organisations, not systems. So we've done very well at driving up organisational efficiency. And I think now is a good time to look at, and so I think Simon Stevens has had for some time a vision of how we need to join back up elements of the system, because there are things that when you only focus on your organisation, you are less likely to do other things that might bring about other benefits. So I think that sort of, is that culture, or is it just a sort of systemic issue around the structure of the NHS? I thought that might be in the poll somewhere. And then particularly when it comes to technology, but I think not every technology is generalizable everywhere. So Hugh was talking about how a lot of things are generalizable. I think when you come to technology and the issues around finance, affordability, both from an NHS and a commercial perspective, actually doesn't sometimes limit where an intervention will work and will be wanted. Again, those sort of subtleties we cover in our briefings and all the bewares. We know what is likely to go wrong with interventions, and we can run through a checklist roughly when we hear what you've got to offer to show you and identify for you as a technology company where you might be frustrated by the NHS. So I enjoyed listening to you. Thanks for that.
Cool. So thank you. I mean, I think the scale of what we're talking about is immense. You've got 1.2, 1.3 full-time equivalents, and it's a lot of people, a lot of pressure. But obviously, it's all about, it takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people to start the ball rolling. And so I think it's it is a challenge that we can meet. And obviously, Bob is hoping to play a small part in that, helping people to share their stories and everything else. So let's hand over to Rob and his slides. So just to let you know, Hugh, I'm informed the slides went beautifully. So Rob, you can go confidently into your presentation, knowing the slides should progress in time. So over to you.
Thanks again, Neil. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about a section of our briefings that we give to companies twice a month. So if anyone is interested in hearing more about the wider offer of AHSNs, they'll be starting in January. More than welcome. I'm picking up in part because of the theme of today, but also it's an important differentiator in terms of the companies we would like to see more of. Talking about what will help you to get to scaling up. So I might talk a bit about pilotitis later on, but we do attract in a lot of very early stage innovators, but we also have an offer relevant to late stage, where companies will still struggle. And we have, again, some insights as to how you may get around some of those challenges, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail. So as the map on the right hand hopefully shows, there are 15 academic health science networks that covers England, and we've been around since 2013. We have 2 main national commissions, or 3, depending on how you define NHS England improvements. Our main initial commission was from NHS England on general improvement work. We had a very specific commission from NHS Improvement around patient safety. And in the last 3 years, we've had a commission from the Office for Life Science, and it's that element I'm going to focus on and has more direct relevance to technology companies. So the Office for Life Science, for those of you that don't know, is a joint office between the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Department of Health and Social Care. So the difference between that commission and the other commissions is, for the OLS Commission, it is around the technology. It must be around because they're looking at how do you generate some economic growth through supporting companies, whereas the other 2 commissions may involve technology but don't have to. The economic growth, for those of you who think this might be around how do we push technology into the NHS, absolutely not. AHSNs are not performance managers in any way. We raise awareness to enlighten people on what might be possible, but this comes with no authority. And that economic benefit is only gained if there is local uptake or significant local uptake. So it is still back to local frontline staff who ultimately make the decision around which technologies to use. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk very briefly around our sort of practical approach to this. So we see companies of all sizes, shapes, experience, technology types. You're all welcome. It's a very general first offer. In our briefings, we will give you an insight into some of the challenges of the NHS, what do AHSNs do, and how we might signpost you to different parts of the innovation landscape, including funding opportunities through Innovate UK, collaborations through National Institute of Health research, for example. A sense of scale of the work we undertake: 2,500 to 3,000 companies a year are getting one-to-one support from across the 15 AHSNs. About 600 of those are working with more than one AHSN, and about 200 of them have been working with an AHSN for more than 2 years. Most of our work is one-to-one, and as you might imagine, that's quite expensive, and we have a limited bandwidth. So we do select in companies, so we aren't necessarily going to be able to provide in-depth support to every company. We can go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of our support offer, it's broadly in 3 or 4 sort of areas, but starting with the star on the right, the scale up. In terms of what we're after interventions based around the technology that has the potential to go national, if not international. So that might be the first thing we're looking at, is what is your potential when you are ready. What we know is, and this has come from programs such as the Innovation Technology Programme and Rapid Uptake Programme, where companies have specific insights and evidence that they can share in advance, it makes the engagement and adoption process far quicker. So we know what makes your access accelerate. In terms of how do we get there, so that round circle, the circle is really what I'm going to talk about today, is elements of rounding off the evidence. How do you get to that point where you are going to be able to accelerate earlier stage evidence gathering through NICE, NIHR, other organisations and programmes? We're likely to have a signposting role to help you to find those resources that might help you. And what is all this evidence looking to do? It's looking to validate your claims as we would try and capture in something we call a value proposition. And throughout your journey, from starting off with your value proposition, there'll be other offers around how do we help you understand the business aspect and support you in developing your business planning approach. Next slide, please. So this process around getting enough evidence and insight that's going to help you accelerate to scale up. It's a process of persuasion. It's less about gathering evidence. It's more about becoming more convincing. How do you give potential users, adopters, buyers, the confidence that what you say your product or service can do is realizable? On the left-hand side, there are a range of starting points. You might have evidence of an type of intervention that works, and you've borrowed your evidence from someone else's intervention. The more convincing evidence will come from when it's been an evaluation around your product. And so we could work through all of those. And if we just go on to that last transition, hopefully at the bottom you will see told by you on the left-hand side and told by peers on the right-hand side. The reality is people, the message, the value of a message that people carry is influenced by how they perceive you. And for companies, they will perceive you as a vested interest in selling your product. What we ideally want, and what I think where BOB.health, as an example, helps so much, is capturing the peer-to-peer story. Peer-to-peer influence is far more convincing. The language they use, the understanding and insights that comes with how they describe what benefits they've derived from a product or service is just far more convincing. So left-hand side will work sometimes, the right-hand side is going to work even better. If we go on to the next slide, please. In terms of where do you start gathering these evidence and insights? It's somewhere between completing your regulatory requirements and starting to scale up. In fact, your evidence might continue as you're scaling up and beyond. So there isn't a hard and fast, this is where your evidence begins. It's part of your journey, and the important aspect is to be asking the market, people who will use and buy your product, what do they want to hear from others about how effective the product is? It will be a market-informed process. It's a judgment-based, not a rule-based. So if you came to us and said, what evidence do I need? We would encourage you to go and discuss what you have with as wide a group as possible, from patients, their carers, through frontline staff, operational managers, and budget holders. If we go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of real-world evidence, real-world validation, we're more likely to be involved in the right-hand side where the scale of the evaluation or the insights being gained is larger and the degree of control is less. So if you're small scale, relatively controlled, it's more likely to be trial orientation, more likely to be looking at the technical details of what does one individual patient get. Where we come in is more around the, how does this work when you use normal services, normal people, where patients have choice and aren't carefully selected? How does that impact on the benefits that you claim can be realized? And in terms of the role of AHSNs, the sorts of things we might be involved in is at the stage that we believe you're ready for that, helping to broker introductions with potential sites. For some of us, there are about 4 or 5 academic health science networks that have in-house teams who will undertake some of the analytic work. So we might be involved in a gap analysis of the evidence or insights that will help you. We might be involved in designing some of the questions and processes that will help you to close those gaps. And for some of us, we may also be involved in undertaking those evaluations. So a spectrum of offers, not offered by all AHSNs, but we know who does, so we'll be able to point you in the direction. Some of those that don't will outsource it. So Yorkshire and Humber Academic Health Science Network, for example, outsources a lot of its evaluations to the Yorkshire and Humber Health Economics Consortium. Next slide, please. And then just going back to, there is a selection criteria. It's a selection criteria not just for us and the NHS, but also for you. We often hear about pilotitis, the repeated requests to ask for another pilot. Just be aware that it does happen. It happens for a variety of reasons, But the main question we would ask you in terms of before you set out to undertake an evaluation is it going to make a difference to the uptake of your product or service? If it isn't, don't do it. Come and seek advice and look at how we might help you. Is this an indication of the market saying they don't really want you? Is it an indication of the clinicians may really love what you want to do, but they may not be able to afford it? And it's not right or wrong, it's just going in with your eyes open as, is this going to help your business? And we think if we address this one issue, it will reduce the criticism of the NHS around pilotitis. If we go on to the next slide, please. The sorts of things that you might therefore produce, bearing in mind you won't get to a real world evaluation until you've got that patient level evidence. Case studies, particularly around the financial information, so budget impact model, not a cost effectiveness, although cost effectiveness may be important, but from a frontline service, what they'll need to know is, how do I afford you? What do I need up front to be able to make this work? And not every organization will have that upfront cash. Anything that might help around the procurement process and so on. So it's not that this all needs to be done, because you'll have to find out from the market which elements do they need, but this is just a sort of checklist around what might help you. So just in summary, today's a snippet of what AHSNs can do to support you, particularly towards that scaling up phase, which we're very interested in doing. It's part of an existing process that we run. We run briefings twice monthly. You'll find most of your work with Academic Health Science Networks is on a one-to-one basis. We share information between us, so it will help you to fill in that form once, and then we can share you more quickly. And generally, AHSNs are there to help. I look forward to catching up with many of you at some point in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. One of the questions I wanted to ask, I'll just pose a question that's come in from one of our participants. So they're basically flagging, it's a huge organization that we need to transform, 1.3 million staff, it's a huge undertaking. So there's lots of structures and lots of processes. And somebody else sent another question, which I've got on WhatsApp here, which is around, there's lots of GERFT and right care, and there's all of these initiatives. But how do we really get that cultural transformation? And what could maybe all of, whether we're a leader in the NHS or a staff member, or you work for a pharmaceutical company or an AHSN, like what can we do? How can we encourage each other to go the extra mile to make that cultural change? So maybe Hugh, you're on mute, just so that before you speak. But what would be that cultural? How do we as individuals get this right?
I don't. I don't think there's a sort of single simple thing that you do that sort of that you apply an intervention and suddenly your culture changes. It will take time. The experience I had in a large integrated trust of 10,000 people was a journey. It wasn't, we had to go on that journey. We had to walk it, and it was through time that the culture changed. And that will be similar, I think, to what we have to do across the NHS. But I think people are crying out for it. I think people want to see greater devolvement of authority, and I think the evidence base is there when we look at other industries. When you look at, for instance, even the military, the idea of the general standing on the hill commanding, the very large army of 1.3 million people as an effective way of being successful, has gone out decades ago. And business and public sector organizations are very similar. We're actually finding that in order to deliver on some of our complex objectives, we actually have to work with other partners. We have to work in a way which I would almost describe as horizontal accountability and responsibility, so that actually to deliver on some of the long-term plan goals, we actually have to work with councils. We have to work with, with social care. We have to work with education. We have to work with police. We have to work with housing. And when we work with those other agencies in a horizontal way to deliver objectives, instead of our much more traditional working up and down through silos to back to a central department and central minister, we're going to be much more likely to be successful. And I think we're starting to see that in some countries who are making better, and regions which are making better inroads into delivering on public health and health improvement goals. So, for instance, Scandinavian countries, Scotland has moved to much more to a system called outcomes-based accountability, where actually they have cross-cutting objectives that are cutting across different departments and different aspects of society. Northern Ireland has moved to that model, and there are other European countries as well. And I think that's the direction we need to head in. But I think from a leadership point of view, we also have to be very clear that we have to model these behaviors. We have to ensure that if we're going to embed the right culture and a transformational and improvement culture, then we have to support that. We have to put the framework in place. We have to be resilient and persistent in supporting it. I had an old boss and mentor who used to talk about leadership is sort of 95% perspiration and 5% inspiration, because actually embedding a different culture, it is about being relentless in terms of reinforcing and that's the way we're going to do things, but also being authentic to it. That we don't say we're going to have a bottom-up culture, but then the first time we have a sort of a crisis or an issue which isn't being delivered, that we revert to command and control. And I think we've to learn those new behaviors, and it will take time. But I think, there's very clear intent at the sort of board level, at national level, to want to make that journey. I think quite a number of people who've been appointed have come from that sort of background or that belief or that value system. And I think that's a direction, and we've seen that, I think, reinforced over the last 6 months in the response to COVID, where place-based responses, have been agile and effective. And we've seen a lot of the innovations that have happened through COVID that we've captured in our beneficial changes network have actually been because people at a local level are clear on what the overriding purpose is and the objective, but have actually had much more freedom on the high.
Yeah, that's amazing. So allowing people to make some mistakes, obviously with patient safety being a big caveat that that's where you've got to be careful on. But and I think I would say that I think it's about helping people. Telling stories of failure is really, really important, because if people are willing to be brave and talk about where they went wrong or what they might do differently, that's really going to help the next person along the line, as opposed to everyone portraying everything they've done as an award entry and everything being perfect, and therefore no one's picking up on those little nuances which would make each further implementation a little bit better. So Rob, anything you want to add, and then we're going to come to a wrap because we're nearly at the end.
I think Hugh covered the vast majority of what needs to happen. I think the bit I would emphasise, because it's pertinent to our role, picking up on it's the responsibility of leaders to enable. So I think that is their role. It's there to enable and to support. But some of that is also around making sure people can understand the wider situation. So giving the context for what's going on. And the small bit we offer to do in that process is enabling through awareness. So raising awareness of what is possible is an important enabler. So giving people insight, telling people what can be done, showing people what can be done. Our experience in the last 9 months of COVID is the idea that the NHS is slow to adopt, absolutely not. When there is opportunity, when you enable people to do things, it happens very quickly and very effectively. So I think it is around that enabling. But the reality, and again, the emphasis I would put on is for commercial companies who are selling products, it is a cash constrained system. So not everything is possible immediately. Telling people how the benefits will be realized from an investment is part of your challenge as a commercial company, of which we can help. So enabling, but ultimately it sits with leaders to support that enablement.
Awesome. So thank you very much. Just a quick little update on the poll. Interestingly, we obviously didn't have the cultural elements in there. We'll do that for the next one. But one of the thing that got about, if I'm getting the colours right, 2/3 of the results is there's no standard way to share. So people just don't know how to do it. Maybe they should look at Bob. Anyway, that's for another day. So chaps, thank you so much for joining us. We have overrun, so thank you everyone for hanging on. I just want to thank Hugh and Rob again. We are going to play a little video as we say goodbye. So the first time I spoke to Hugh, he talked about that point he made earlier around us need to sort of being the harvesters. So it's the adopters. We should be celebrating the adopters, not just the innovators. And he mentioned this. He said, "Do you remember that clip from a long time ago that went around on email? It was even early days of social media. So 2009, you might recall a clip with a guy dancing on a hill. He's at the Sasquatch Music Festival in the US. There's a singer called Santigold singing a song called Unstoppable. And you see this lovely man dancing, and then slowly the crowd comes together. And Hugh sort of flagged that to me. So I think that's what we need to celebrate, is people coming together, us all being unstoppable when it comes to improvement and adopting innovation. So we'll say goodbye and play the video. It was probably on an iPhone 4. The sound's a bit scratchy. It's a bit wobbly, but you will get an adrenaline rush, I promise, if you watch it to the end. It's a 2.5-minute clip. So thank you very much from all three of us, and take care. Have a good evening.